Chapter 281, Enhanced Combat Prowess. 7 days later, Ethan checked in for his flight out of the Fengyuan region. What had begun as a simple resource run turned into far more. Besides a substantial haul of credits and rare materials, he delivered a major power boost to all of his elf companions. Throughout the past week's battles in the arena, he'd systematically tested every new skill and piece of equipment each elf had earned during training, and the results spoke for themselves. With only a few days left until they set sail for Trial Island, Ethan received a message via the Shadow Group's secure communicator. Ying's envoy confirmed their departure. At dusk tomorrow, they were to rendezvous at the same harbor they'd used when leaving Dead City. Miss that window, and unless he'd already perished, the Rocket's relentless pursuit would catch up to him, and Ethan had no intention of hiding. For most competitors, the final trial was a nightmare foretold, but to Ethan it was an opportunity, the chance to push his team and himself beyond every limit. He nodded to himself, recalling the determined faces of his elves as they followed his lead into every fray. He also had a separate ticket booked to Golden City, reserved online days ago. A brief text to Dawu explained that he'd be occupied for a while. As for Kokodola, she could pass along any further messages the next time they met. Everything was in place. Tomorrow's voyage would mark the beginning of the greatest challenge Ethan and his elves had ever faced. Ethan methodically reviewed his supplies. Anything he could source, he'd already ordered in bulk, and he promised himself he'd cover any unexpected deficits, no matter how much it cost. With that settled, he dialed Master Yagyu, the venerable alchemist who'd taken him on as an apprentice. As he'd anticipated, Yagyu's voice crackled over the line with apologies. He was buried in experiments and couldn't spare the time. Ethan offered a quick, "Understood," then ended the call without a second thought. He dropped his phone into the newly acquired extra-dimensional ring resting on his desk. His original ring had filled up almost immediately after his first big windfall, so he'd splurged at the black market on this larger model. He didn't know how long he'd be gone this time, and he intended to stockpile enough provisions to last the duration. Inside the ring, his creatures clamored for space and food. The tropical dragon, by far his hungriest companion, could consume as much grain as all his other beasts combined. Ethan had no choice but to allocate half his entire grain reserve to feed it. A steep price, but worth every kernel. The dragon was the strongest of his mounts, its wings granting both battlefield dominance and the swiftest means of escape when danger struck. Throughout the competition, the elves had focused on mastering control over their bodies, and countless battles had already honed their instincts. This promotion round, however, was unlike any before. Success wasn't handed out for merely completing drills, but earned through true one-on-one duels and relentless training that pushed each contestant to their breaking point, triggering a natural level up. With the exception of the tropical dragons and the Tyrannosaurus dragons, almost every elf rose by 1 rank. Ethan's claw-tailed scorpion, formerly the lowest level summon, had just climbed to level 23. No longer the weakest in the roster, it even overtook Big Milk Tank and at last shed its underdog label. A surge of pride washed over Ethan. He'd long hoped for this moment. Big Milk Tank, by contrast, served as a water support elf rather than a frontline fighter, so she didn't mind her scorpion companion's ascent. Thanks to the high-energy calcium tablets Ethan provided, the claw-tailed scorpion now stood a sturdy 1 meter tall, its frame recalling that of a young calf. Every day, Big Milk Tank faithfully gave it several cups of milk and a dusting of calcium flakes, ensuring their champion continued to grow stronger. Are they really incapable of growing any larger? Ethan murmured, staring at the scorpion. A typical specimen only reached about 80 centimeters in height, yet this one already stood a full 20 centimeters taller, and it was still growing. Around him, the pack beasts and mules lumbered through their drills, endlessly practicing the skills they'd just acquired. Compared to Paula's natural affinity for ice magic, these creatures were struggling even with the most basic fire flare. They had spent countless sessions learning to shape the jet flame and were still far from perfecting it. After all, mastering a skill required more than rote repetition. Physical conditioning and mana control exercises were just as vital. Still, Ethan allowed himself a small smile. At last, his team boasted an elf who could wield fire magic, however crudely, and Paula's frozen light spell had already proven its worth countless times. Her talent for the ice element was extraordinary, so much so that even Ethan, who prided himself on being well-traveled, couldn't help but be impressed. When they finally confronted the dragon spirit, she would be their greatest asset. Under Ethan's guidance, Paula had moved beyond mere formal incantations. She was beginning to experiment with subtle, derivative techniques that only a prodigious ice mage could discover. The path ahead remained perilous, but with these new skills unfolding, the odds were finally tipping in their favor. Take, for example, the boulder skill in its current form. The elf summons a handful of ice cubes and hurls them at his opponent. It works, but it's still just raw ice. Why not refine those cubes into something sharper and more compact? Say, an ice cone that could impale as well as freeze. That's exactly the kind of directional thinking Paula needs to develop in her training. As for Dark Crow, he's now perfectly comfortable carrying a 70-pound load without losing an ounce of speed. Ethan can say without hesitation that Dark Crow has met his development benchmarks. If a high-grade dark stone surfaces, Crow won't even pause, he'll evolve on the spot. Of course, that doesn't mean he's reached the pinnacle of his power, it just means he's achieved Ethan's minimum standard. Further growth is still possible, though the cost-to-benefit ratio has shifted from its early stages. And finally, Ghost Stone. In these past 7 days, he's absorbed a full vial of poisonous gas and shrugged off the effects. From now on, toxins and venom won't slow him down the way they once did. If Ethan wanted to continue developing poisonous traits, he'd need a different specimen. He'd originally planned to refine venom from the scorpion-tailed scorpion, but that process would take far too long, and with the final trial only weeks away, he had no choice but to put it on hold. In the meantime, he threw himself into improving the elves. By carefully analyzing how energy crystallized on the test chips and refining his approach, Ethan began to see steady progress. The biggest leap came with the hulking Big Milk Tank. Once its bioliquid was a pale, almost washed-out green, it had gradually deepened to a vibrant shade, an unmistakable sign that its inherent qualifications were on the rise. Ethan even began negotiating a new supply deal with the milk tank farm. Each elf would receive a daily blend of energy crystals and medicinal herbs to boost their aptitudes with minimal side effects. Of course, not every elf was the same. Those with lower base qualifications still took more effort to raise than the naturally gifted. But with this regimen, even the weaker specimens were starting to show real improvement. Except for the light green-ranked Great Milk Tank, which, after 7 days of continuous use, has undergone dramatic changes. The other classifications have shown almost no movement. The green-ranked Dark Crow barely budged in that same week, and the light Scienteers hardly shift in hue at all, though at least they carry minimal side effects. All Ethan needs now is time. Once the waiting period ends, he'll finally be able to elevate his elf's rank, a goal every adventurer dreams of. Chapter 282, Return to Deadleaf City. Ethan stared at the latest training reports, his expression grim. So many trainers had poured months or even years into raising their original elves, only to find that fresh recruits on the market had such superior base stats that their veterans simply couldn't keep pace. Forced to abandon those long-cherished companions, they watched years of effort evaporate in an instant, a loss almost impossible to recover from. Not everyone suffered this fate. Trainers like Dawu and Du, along with the Alliance's elite members, had been granted early access to premium Isangia elves. From the very start, they partnered with top-quality creatures, nurturing them without fear of obsolescence. Ethan remembered how, in his previous life, he'd scrambled to replace his elves whenever their qualifications lagged. Constantly swapping in newer recruits severed the bonds he needed most. Then, when truly formidable opponents arrived, his freshly captured elves balked at the fight and scattered. Without loyal defenders, he'd fallen and died far too easily. Was there really such a yawning gap between a quasi-king-level powerhouse and someone at full Tianwang strength? Absolutely. But did that mean escape was hopeless? Not if you were willing to sacrifice a few elves as rearguards. A tactical retreat remained possible, but at a steep price. Ethan's jaw clenched. Back in Deadleaf City, he vowed he would never repeat his past mistakes. He would secure elite partners from the outset, forge unbreakable bonds, and train them to stand firm even against the Tianwang. And if defeat loomed, he'd ensure a handful of seasoned elves stayed behind to cover his withdrawal. With his resolve hardened, Ethan stepped forward. This time, nothing would catch him unprepared. Ethan remembered how, in his previous life, he'd stood against the powerful, and how, among the elves, only the Dark Raven had remained. In this new life, he'd learned that the bond he forged with an elf mattered far more than its raw qualification score. Items capable of boosting an elf's innate rank were exceedingly rare and costly, and medium-sized energy crystals, while relatively common, offered only marginal improvement. According to the readings on his augmentation device, these medium crystals could nudge a light green, green, or even dark green elf up a notch. But once an elf's qualification reached light cyan or higher, the crystal's effect all but vanished. To make real progress at that level, he'd need large energy crystals, commodities that, if stockpiled in quantity, would instantly draw the rocket's attention. The top echelons of the rockets might not bat an eye, but middle-rank officers, captains and squad leaders would jump at the chance to investigate. So Ethan settled on a cautious compromise. He'd feed his elves just enough medium-sized crystals to keep their qualifications roughly in line with his own steadily increasing power. It wasn't ideal, but it kept him under the rocket's radar, and after all, time was on his side for now. Besides, compared to the weeks it would take a cruise ship to cross the ocean, the chartered aircraft carried them in a matter of hours. Even under strict surveillance, the flight's speed and efficiency were impossible to argue with. Ethan sat quietly on the plane, eyes closed in meditation. As the engines eased and the wing dipped, he felt the shift in air pressure signaling their descent. When he finally opened his eyes, the Golden City spread out below him, a restless maze of lights and noise that never slept. His constant practice in breath control and mental focus had sharpened his concentration. He'd made the trip without once glancing out the window or losing himself in idle thoughts. Yet no matter how many times he disciplined his mind, one presence remained: Nezuki. The sorceress of Golden City was as unpredictable as she was powerful, her true abilities a mystery. Every encounter left Ethan wary. He neither trusted her nor fully understood how to resist her subtle influence. He shook his head, resolving to face that challenge later. On the tarmac, a taxi waited. Ethan climbed in and said, "South District, please." By law, elves were forbidden to take to the air within city limits. Police had the right to detain any who disobeyed. Only the strongest could risk flight, and none who flew too openly. Ethan was far from that level. The taxi wove through congested streets for nearly 2 hours before emerging into the city's quieter outskirts. Here, the high-rises gave way to low-slung warehouses and dusty lanes. Ethan stepped out, slinging his pack over one shoulder. This was his third visit to these suburbs. The first time, he'd come for rare alchemical ingredients hidden in abandoned estates. The second, he'd ventured through the hamster cavern on his way to Deadleaf City. Now, for the third time, he stood at the ferry terminal bound for Trial Island, his final test. He checked his belongings one last time: provisions, toolkits, and a shimmering token from his mentor. Nothing remained but his resolve and the unshakable thought of Nezuki. With a steadying breath, Ethan turned toward the docks, ready at last to face his destiny. Freed at last from the elves' restrictions, Ethan called his tropical dragon, and instantly the great beast appeared at his side. With practiced confidence, he vaulted onto its broad, moss-green back. He'd ridden this dragon long enough to know he no longer needed clumsy guardians to see him through the skies. Reaching into his pack, Ethan produced several glowing energy cubes and offered them to the dragon. Its eyes fluttered shut in bliss as it snapped them down, every morsel fueling the power in its wings. Thanks to the chlorophyll woven into its scales, sunny days meant effortless photosynthesis and almost no energy drain when it took to the air. With a gentle beat of its wings, the dragon stirred up a swirl of dust at the launch point, then rose in a steady, graceful climb. Ethan lay flat against the animal's broad back, feeling no jostle as they ascended. When they'd gained enough altitude, he gave the dragon a soft pat. Instantly, it flexed its wings again and surged forward, cutting into the sky with unrivaled ease. Ethan eyed his mount's broad, chlorophyll-infused wings with satisfaction. Thanks to that unique trait, the tropical dragon glided through the sky with ease. Its racial speed rating wasn't outstanding. After all, it was bred for battle, not outright racing, but in a straight line it never faltered. Endurance, too, seemed limitless. Under the sun's warmth, the dragon could soar from dawn until dusk without tiring. Following Ethan's direction, they set course for Deadleaf City. Before long, they began passing flocks of wild elf riders. At the sight of the tropical dragon, even these seasoned aerial knights fell silent. Most elves rode great-beaked griffins or peebee birds, creatures mighty in their own right, but utterly overshadowed by a draconic powerhouse. Officially, the tropical dragon lacked the dragon spirit classification, yet its bloodstream pulsed with such primal ferocity that any doubt evaporated. In the sky, it was as dominant as a Tyrannosaurus dragon ruling the prehistoric depths. Below them, groups of airborne elves, averaging level 10 or higher, with a few pushing past level 20, kept their distance. Who would dare challenge a level 40 tropical dragon? Unopposed, Ethan and his mount pressed on. 2 hours later, the spired rooftops and ivy-clad walls of Deadleaf City rose into view. Before reaching the outskirts of Deadleaf City, Ethan gently landed his tropic dragon, fed it a few energy cubes, and then recalled it into its Pokeball. Now that his presence is on Team Rocket's radar, he needs to stay as low-key as possible. After all, he was the one the studio whisked off Trial Island, and sooner or later, he'll have to go back. This assignment is too high profile to go unnoticed. Plenty of eyes are on him, not only the senior officers, but also the powerful captains who have been tailing him ever since Trial Island. There, everyone moved under strict surveillance, and with the Shadow Organization pulling strings from the shadows, Ethan has already become a threat, not directly to them, but to their plans. That's precisely why he set his course for the Fengyuan region, where he can train without so many people watching. Who knows how many operatives from Kanto and Chengdu have been dogging his trail? His reputation as the studio's prodigy won't guarantee his safety, or even his life, once those hidden eyes catch up. But in Fengyuan, he'll have the freedom he needs to grow stronger. Ethan watched as the rockets screamed inward, none of them managing to breach his defenses. Whatever had happened to him in the Fengyuan sector remained shrouded in rumor. There simply hadn't been enough attackers to give a clear account. It was obvious, however, that he'd been holding back, concealing the true depth of his power. Part 3. The next phase, Chapter 283, Fierce Shot. Ethan arrived at Aoba City's freighter terminal just as dawn broke over the harbor. He had arranged a discreet heads-up with a trusted dock worker, and now he knew exactly which vessel was the rocket freighter preparing to sail. Slipping through the crowds, he found the small ship with rocket freighter stenciled along its hull. 3 burly sailors barred the gangway. "This is a private vessel," growled the tallest among them, planting a massive hand on the railing. "No unauthorized boarding." Ethan paused, expression calm. From his jacket, he produced the Shadow Group medals, emblems earned alongside his comrades, and held them out casually. For a heartbeat, the lead sailor's eyes flickered with recognition and bemused curiosity. Then his smirk returned, and he refused to move. The 2 sailors flanking him exchanged amused glances, clearly enjoying the power play. Ethan understood they didn't know who he really was or why he was here. Perhaps they answered to rival rocket officers or some other faction entirely. It didn't matter. He was no longer the green recruit who just stepped off Ocean Island. A low hum of energy stirred beneath Ethan's jacket, subtle but unmistakable. He shifted his stance, muscles coiling with quiet force. The sailors' confident grins faltered as the air around Ethan crackled. Without a word, they dropped their hands, stepping back in instant deference. Ethan nodded once, then strode up the gangway. The deck creaked under his boots, and the 3 sailors watched him pass with a mix of awe and unease. As he reached the hold of the rocket freighter, Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The ship, like everything on this mission, was once again under his control. Ethan's eyes went cold. If these sailors insisted on making him their enemy, they would pay the price. With a flick of his wrist, a slim dagger materialized in his right hand, its polished blade catching the lantern light. In one fluid motion, he slashed at the lead sailor's forearm from an oblique angle. The sailor wasn't defenseless. He jerked his arm back instinctively, but not fast enough. The blade scored a clean cut, blood arcing onto the wooden deck, yet the dagger itself remained unstained. So precise and swift was Ethan's strike that it might as well have drawn no blood. Had the sailor not recoiled at that instant, his arm would have been gravely maimed. Pain and recognition flickered in the sailor's eyes. A murderous rage replaced his fear as he stared at Ethan. Behind him knelt two more men, both blindfolded, trembling at the brutal display. None of them had ever witnessed violence so clinical, so merciless. Ethan said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. There would be no bargaining now, only the cold certainty of what would come next. Ethan felt the heavy weight of their scrutiny the moment they confronted him. A squadron captain from the Rockets, flanked by two subordinates, stepped forward. "You there! Stop!" the captain barked, eyeing Ethan's Shadow Group medal. "Let's see what you're really capable of. We've got orders, and a nice little bonus, if you bring back proof of your strength." Ethan barely registered the captain's words before the men closed in. The increase in tension was nothing new. He'd learned long ago that authority figures loved testing newcomers, but there was something in the captain's tone that stung. He'd just been told Ethan was only a teenager who hadn't even completed Trial Island, yet here he was, daring to wear the emblem of the Shadow Group. The captain chuckled under his breath. In his mind, a kid like Ethan couldn't possibly be worth more than a few cheap thrills. Only the elders of the Shadow Group would recognize the medal's value. To everyone else, its bearer was just another reckless boy with misplaced ambition. As a Rockets squadron captain, he convinced himself he'd have the upper hand. Shadow Group members at the junior level were said to be no stronger than a command-level officer, and he'd barely had time in his post, let alone faced a real threat. His two underlings, both newly promoted from the deck crew, would make quick work of this threat. Teach him a lesson, then report back, collect the promised bonus. Simple. Casting a glance toward the cabin door, the captain saw that the higher-up aboard ship had heard the orders his predecessor gave. The officer inside hadn't objected, so the mission was his to carry out. Smirking, the captain took a step forward, ready to prove that this teenager was no match for a rocket squadron captain and his men. But Ethan stood his ground, dark eyes locked on the newcomers, determined to show that titles and medals meant nothing without the strength to back them up. Captain Thorne's lips curled in contempt as he faced the boy before him. Just promoted to squadron captain, he wasn't about to be humiliated by some green recruit. "You insolent brat," he spat. "You're begging for death." With that, he flipped a dagger from his belt and slashed toward Ethan's midsection. Sparks erupted where steel met steel. Ethan, still young and far less experienced than the hardened officer, knew he couldn't match Thorne in a straight duel. He pivoted on his heel, deflecting the blow just in time, and sprang 2 paces back to create distance. He reminded himself that this world might be ruled by elves, but humans still fought fiercely. Assassins like Aju, the future Poison King, relied on stealth and elven magic only as supplements. No matter your race or your favored tactics, raw physical training and quick thinking remained the ultimate edge. Stood at a disadvantage in close-quarters combat, Ethan's gaze hardened. He drew in a steadying breath, channeled the mana slimly radiating between his palms, and spoke the words with icy calm. "Ghost Stone, Shadow Ball." In an instant, a swirling orb of shadow and crackling energy coalesced above his hand. Thorne's confidence wavered as the eldritch sphere glimmered to life, just long enough for Ethan to seize control of the fight. Ethan's Ghost Stone, long concealed in the depths of his shadow, suddenly materialized in his outstretched palm. In an instant, 2 orbs of crackling dark energy formed, and he hurled them at the 3 sailors clustered on the deck. The man in front saw the projectiles and went white. He stumbled backward, arms flailing, as the ship lurched underfoot. The 2 behind him weren't so lucky. Both were struck full in the chest by the shadowy spheres, their bodies buckling under the force. Even beings blessed with immortality couldn't shrug off a blow like that. But Ethan wasn't finished. A thunderous boom echoed across the planks, sending splinters flying. The only sailor who'd managed to dive clear of the blast scrambled for the elven orb at his hip, but Ethan closed the distance too quickly to let him use it. "Ghost Stone. Poison shot," he commanded. In a blink, Ghost Stone used its shadow shuttle ability to reappear before the desperate sailor. 3 clawed fingers coalesced with a sinister violet miasma, then drove it straight at the man's face. Before the poison could take hold, a powerful voice cut through the melee. "Enough!" On the bow of the cargo ship, a newcomer stood, silhouetted against the sky, his stern gaze fixed on Ethan and the fallen crew. Chapter 4. Return to Zinshokun. 2 sailors struck squarely by the shadow sphere lay motionless on the deck, their life extinguished. The man who'd rushed to warn Ethan's deputy Mavis had collapsed in a grotesque heap, and all at once, Ethan's wrath flared. He stared down at the fallen form, eyes gleaming with ice, as he signaled Ghost Stone to finish the job. Ghost Stone obeyed without hesitation. Its poison-tipped claw hovered mere centimeters from the wounded sailor's face. The survivor's eyes widened in fear, sweat breaking out across his brow. If the shadow hadn't spoken up from the cabin, or if the elf hadn't been summoned in time, the man would have died beneath those lethal talons. "Stop this!" The ship's captain, hidden in the shadows, finally broke his silence. His voice boomed across the deck. "Stop!" came a second, urgent command. Ethan recognized the voice. It was the shadow itself, speaking through the crackling comlink. Ethan's expression faltered. He lowered his hand. "Pull back," he ordered, and Ghost Stone drew its claw away. A tense stillness settled over the deck. The wounded sailor gasped for breath, staring up at Ghost Stone in stunned gratitude. Around them, the squadron shuffled uneasily, waiting to see if Ethan would relent. He met the captain's eyes, then Mavis's. Duty demanded ruthlessness, but there was honor in mercy. Ethan nodded once. "Let him live," he said quietly. With the crisis averted, Ethan rallied his squadron. Their course was set. They would sail back to Zinshu to regroup, heal their wounds, and prepare for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 284. Stand in line. Ethan lay prone on the deck, pinned there alongside a sailor by the levitating Ghost Stone. From the rail above, Ying stepped forward and looked down at them. The captain, who had first tried to block Ethan's path, snapped to attention at her approach, saluted crisply, then fell back to one side. His stare at Ethan was cold, murderous. Ethan met Ying's gaze without fear. Despite the Ghost Stone's grip, he refused to relinquish his power. A defiant smile crept across his face, enough for Ying to notice. She merely shook her head and said, "Not yet. We're almost there." In that moment, everything fell into place. The officer who had intervened wasn't merely one of Ying's shadow operatives. He'd sent the sailor forward on purpose, testing Ethan. Whoever he really was, it took real authority to stand so casually in Ying's presence. And that faint, knowing smile revealed he'd enjoyed the trial. Ethan felt a flicker of satisfaction. He pushed himself to his feet, determination hardening in his chest, and began to walk toward the man who'd challenged him. The next move was theirs. Whatever came, he was ready. He saw that the Ghost Stone's power couldn't move him, but when their eyes locked, raw violence and fury shone clear in Ethan's gaze. Ethan's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. He crouched down, and without a word, lightly tapped the man's cheek. Pinned beneath him and seething, the man's reddened face betrayed his anger. If not for the Ghost Stone holding him in place, he'd have leapt up to fight. Only when his ally Ying gripped his arm did he realize Ethan wouldn't kill him outright. His right hand, trapped under Ethan's weight, quivered as it began to move. Seeing the rage flare in those eyes only made Ethan's smile broader. In an instant, the glint in his gaze turned ice cold. A dagger materialized in his freed right hand. With a single, ruthless slash across the man's torso, Ethan severed his arm at the waist and snatched up the elven orb it had been clutching. "You," the wounded man gasped. From the shadows behind him, the captain opened his mouth to shout, but before a sound could escape, a silhouette slipped out of the gloom, freezing him in place. Ethan stood a few paces behind Ying, his chest still heaving from the fight. Moments ago, a squadron captain had charged in, sure of himself, guns drawn, only to end up sprawled on the ground, clutching the stump where his arm had been severed. The sight of a seasoned officer reduced to agony was enough to make anyone's blood run cold. Before Ethan could gather his wits, an envoy's subordinate, dressed in dark livery, approached and bowed low to Ying. "Sir, my master demands that you surrender these men. Anyone who interferes with his designs must be dealt with." Ying didn't even turn. His voice was a quiet blade. "These men are under the protection of my shadow division. I will not tolerate your interference. Go back and tell your master we will meet again. He can get the rest of his message from me personally." The envoy's aide flushed with anger, but dared not protest. "Yes, sir." He retreated into the gathering dusk without another word. Ethan let out a shaky breath. Relief mixed with adrenaline as he watched the man slip away. He glanced back at the wounded captain, who was still groaning on the ground. Ying had the power to finish him off, no question, but chose not to. Killing the captain now would serve no purpose. The lesson had already been delivered. In truth, there had been two reasons Ying allowed a squadron captain to test Ethan in the first place. One was the mysterious patron backing the envoy, a force even Ying respected. The other, and more crucial, was the test itself. If Ethan couldn't stand firm in a life-or-death confrontation like this, he'd never survive the island's trials. Better to see his strength now than mourn his death and disgrace later. Around them, the guards shifted uneasily, but Ying remained silent, the tension hanging in the air like a promise and a warning. Whoever failed under his watch would answer Faye, or it. And Ethan knew he'd just survived his first true trial. Now, with the final trial drawing to a close, Ethan found himself unable to move. His chance had slipped away. Yet his performance hadn't disappointed Master Ying. Earlier, he'd boldly severed the captain's arm and ordered the rest to stand down, effectively halting their rival's challenge. Around him, comrades knelt in grief over the fallen, but Ethan paid them no mind. Under the watchful gaze of the shadowy figure, he stepped onto the waiting boat, each footfall precise and controlled. When he reached the spot where the captain had once stood, Ethan came to attention and offered a crisp salute. "Master Ying," he said. Ying's eyes followed Ethan's salute, and a slow smile curved his lips. "You tangled with a captain just now," he observed, amusement dancing in his tone. "Tell me, were you afraid?" Leaning forward, Ying studied Ethan's face as if searching for a flicker of doubt. Ethan recognized at once that this captain was far from the lowest rung. There were higher-ups in the Shadow's hierarchy who could issue orders of far greater consequence. Yet he remained outwardly calm. "Captain or no," Ethan replied evenly, "he's only a captain. As long as I gave him no cause, he'd never trouble me." For a moment the Shadow stood silent, then burst into clear, approving laughter that echoed across the deck. Ying Xiao leaned back against the wall, arms folded. "Kid, you're sharp," he said with a slow nod. "But aren't you worried someone might strike from behind? We're talking about a cadre-level officer here." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, then added, "And yet here you stand, still itching for a fight. Care to explain?" Ethan glanced around at the bulked-up rocket agents milling nearby. He gave Ying Xiao a confident smile. The older man's smirk faded as he took in Ethan's steady gaze. "Listen," Ying Xiao warned, his tone growing serious. "Taking on a cadre means facing pressure you can't even imagine. You know what that entails." Ethan's smile vanished. In Team Rocket, the only way to become a cadre is by rising to Uranus-class trainer rank, and today he was set to face exactly that level of opponent. No, he wasn't naive about the dangers. If your faction can't hold its ground in the shadows, why should anyone come rushing to protect you? Raw talent counts for little unless you've earned real experience. Plenty of trainers start out gifted, very few grow strong enough to lead. Only those who survive the grind gain the right to speak. Right now, Ethan was just a small cog in the turbulent power plays of competing rocket factions. It was time to pick a side and stake his claim on the only stability and strength that mattered. Ethan knew there was no angle here. Trying to play both sides would only earn the Shadow's ire. He'd risked everything to protect the squadron captain, only to see that man slip away into someone else's arms. Unthinkable. If he wanted the Shadow's protection, he had to demonstrate absolute loyalty. In the Rockets, the only real power was the faction itself. To Ethan's knowledge, Ying and Nazi were both staunch members, two heavenly-level warriors nobody dared question, no matter their personal grudges. The Shadow's cold chuckle before the screening had been anything but amusement. He'd already pieced it together. He knew Ethan had witnessed every detail of the captain's arm being severed, and he intended to keep that fact in reserve. Still, Ethan had moved faster than anyone predicted, and for now he remained too useful to cast aside. After all, the man who'd been tailing the captain never once looked Ethan in the eye. The balance of power was delicate, and Ethan wasn't about to let himself be the one to tip the scales. Chapter 7. Ethan stood at the stern of the boat, watching the lone man hunched over the railing, his shoulders shaking with uncontrollable sobs. The moonlight glinted off the water, but did little to ease the man's anguish. Ethan frowned. "Ghost Stone, cast your calming spell. Let him compose himself." A soft, raspy laugh echoed from the little orb in Ethan's hand. Ghost Stone's glow pulsed as it whispered its enchantment. Almost instantly, the man's wails tapered into tremulous breaths. He sank to his knees, head bowed, tears still wetting his cheeks, but his cries finally stilled. "Enough," Ethan said, slipping Ghost Stone into his coat pocket. He spared the man one cold glance. He served no faction's purposes and held no leverage for Ethan's plans. Unneeded, unhelpful, he'd be left behind. A flicker of movement caught Ethan's eye, a shadow slipping toward the cabin door. Without a word, Ethan followed it inside. The lantern-lit corridor was empty, silent but for the creaking timbers beneath his boots. Whatever, or whoever, had left that shadow would be waiting deeper in the ship's belly, and Ethan intended to find them. Author's note. Thanks for reading. If you enjoyed this chapter, please consider subscribing and sharing. Your support keeps the story sailing on. Chapter 285, Beat. When they returned to the cabin, Ying set out a tray of candied citron and an elegant array of tea ceremony utensils across the table. Ethan studied him curiously. Tea ceremonies among elves, too? Without a word, Ying beckoned Ethan to sit opposite him. Ethan complied, channeling every scrap of composure he had. He'd faced Ying before without fear. He thought he understood the elf's intentions, but in the King of Heaven's presence, respect was mandatory. For a long moment, Ying simply fingered the delicate porcelain, sliding on a leather glove, then flexing each digit smoothly. Ethan realized the rocket scientist must have replaced Ying's lost fingers with mechanical prostheses. At last, Ying broke the silence. "You ventured into the Fengyuan region," he said, his eyes never lifting from the teapot. Ethan nodded. "I did." Ying began to brew. Pale steam curled from the spout, carrying the scent of jasmine and citrus. He puffed the aroma to his nose, closed his eyes in pleasure, then poured 2 cups of amber tea. With a satisfied nod, he pushed 1 cup across the table to Ethan. "Drink," Ying said softly. "Then tell me everything you saw." Ethan sat across from Ying, his gaze flicking warily between the steaming cup of tea and the man opposite him. He wasn't sure whether it was the tea's exquisite aroma or Ying's unexpected suggestion that made his pulse quicken. "What's your real impression of the Fengyuan region?" Ying asked again, folding his hands on the table. Ethan inhaled the fragrant steam before answering. "It's a tangle of rival factions and shifting alliances. No single group holds much influence there." He took a careful sip, letting the delicate blend crafted by the heavenly powers settle on his tongue. Ying nodded, setting his own cup aside. "And this trial I've arranged, are you ready for it?" Ethan met his friend's steady stare. "I'll give it everything I've got," he said. "But I won't pretend I know what our opponents have in store." On the island, Ethan might have rated his chances at 90% against the usual challengers. But these weren't local hotshots. They were agents dispatched by the senior cotters themselves, with no predictable limits. One of them had even been a former captain under those same authorities. After Ethan vanished from Rocket Command's surveillance, they grew wary of his abilities. Now, as soon as he sets foot in Fengyuan, they'll have an operative shadowing his every move, and if he slips up, they won't hesitate to eliminate him. Ethan's unexpected display of power had caught everyone off guard, including Ying. None of them really knew how strong he was, and Ying was eager to find out. It just so happened that this curiosity aligned perfectly with what the other cadre officers wanted, which is how the earlier confrontation came about. But Ethan hadn't even given his opponent a chance to land a single blow. In the blink of an eye, he'd pinned him to the ground and held him there. The only thing the opponent managed to release was a single phantom stone, a mere hint of Ethan's true capabilities. Of course, one phantom stone hardly reflected his full strength, but it was enough to set tongues wagging. Ethan himself remembered that Ying once wielded a Geng-class phantom stone, which back then ranked only second or third among all phantoms. He wondered how much more powerful it had become. Ying settled back in his chair, lifted his teacup, and regarded Ethan with a bemused smile. This time, 4 cadre-level officers and 5 quasi-cadre captains are taking part in the trials. You're the only one who doesn't have any backing, he said. Around them, 4 king-class elites prepared their strategies like players sizing up a chessboard. 5 quasi-king operators lurked on the sidelines, waiting for their moment to strike, and countless other powerful figures watched in silent anticipation. Chapter 7. Survival Mode. Even the slightest tremor set them off like starving dogs, ravenous survivors clawing at any weakness they could find. This was the rocket's Surviva, L mode in full swing. Ethan crouched behind a fractured bulkhead, surveying the chaos. So all 5 captains have been shipped out to Trial Island, he said, and the cadres will join in later? Rico pushed himself up from the debris, flashing a teasing grin. You really think only the 9 I mentioned are taking part? Count on at least 20 competitors. Those 9 are just the heavy hitters. Of the 10 people you saw on the island, only 1 belongs to that top tier. The rest are nothing more than ordinary captains. Ethan frowned. Hold on, anyone can volunteer for this? The aspiring captains aren't risking much. Even if they fail, they don't get tossed into the abyss. Then why are the cadre trials so cutthroat? Rico's grin turned wry. Because these cadres aren't your run-of-the-mill officers. They're Uranus-level powerful, and with Uranus-level power comes Uranus-level pride. Ethan nodded slowly. He remembered 3 of the island's participants in particular, 3 who recognized him on sight. Guga, the younger brother of one of the captains, Jasmine, leader of the female squad, and Alec, the lone wolf reputed to be the island's strongest warrior. Each of them had stared at him with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Now, amid the roar of combat and the scramble for supplies, Ethan realized how little he truly understood about the rules of this deadly game. Behind him, the rocket's engines shuddered in standby. Beyond the smoldering wreckage, Trial Island awaited, its trials more brutal than any of them had yet imagined. And for Ethan and the others, survival would demand far more than mere strength. It would test their pride, their alliances, and ultimately their very will to live. Ethan's eyes narrowed at the mention of quasi-Uranus. Those on the cusp of the Uranus rank were already terrifying, one step from godlike power. But these self-righteous captains acted as though they were invincible, lions fighting wolves, cats tangling with dogs. It was absurd. Who on this island had really tasted true strength? A future cadre? Guga? Jasmine? Alec? Or someone else entirely? If Ethan had to guess, Guga was the biggest threat. The shadow hadn't said, and Ethan dared not pry. What unsettled him most wasn't the captains themselves, but the cadre-trained soldiers under their command. Ying gave him a mocking grin. The fellow you crossed this time is only a captain on paper, but he's got a full cadre backing him. You've already tangled with 1 cadre member and even a cadre in training. What do you think that makes you? Ethan forced a bitter smile. Whether it was a heavenly king or the mightier king of heaven, such figures were leagues beyond him. Even in his previous life, at the mere sight of them, he'd have retreated without a second thought. He held up his hands in mock surrender. Please, no more teasing. I've got no one powerful watching my back here. Shadow was Ethan's greatest backer in the Rockets. If you wanted to follow the money, or the influence, Nazi carried some weight too. After all, Nazi shared a special bond with Ying. Ying laughed again. He was normally all business, but today he was in rare spirits. You know I've blocked a lot of people for you, he said, amusement dancing in his eyes. But you need to understand, once someone ceases to be useful, they lose their refuge. That's true in any organization, even the Rockets. Ethan remained silent, absorbing every word. People without real strength can survive only under the protection of the strong, and only as long as they serve a purpose. Tail-waving and begging for mercy aren't long-term solutions. You have to grow, and grow fast. Do you grasp what the Shadow is doing here? He didn't raise you from the ground up. He rescued you halfway through your journey. That kind of trust can't run very deep. If you want to keep his protection, You must stay in step with him and constantly prove your value. Only then will he continue to shelter you and buy you some breathing room. Ying's smile turned sharp. That's exactly why the shadow puts you through these tests, to keep you from getting complacent the moment you score a win. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it and nodded. All right, that's enough for today. This is the last day to submit your requests. Make it count. Ethan squared his shoulders. Today was his final chance. He would not squander it. Chapter 286. Return to Trial Island. Once their business was concluded, Ying and Ethan fell into a companionable silence. In the soft glow of the fading light, Ethan lifted his porcelain cup and took a deliberate sip. He'd always liked both tea and coffee, not for the origin of their leaves or beans, but for that upfront bitterness that gives way to a lingering sweetness. It was that contrast, he thought, that made every mouthful memorable. Tonight's tea proved especially strong, its sharp edge clinging to his tongue. Ying shook his head and refilled Ethan's cup, a trace of melancholy in his sigh. It's a shame to squander such fine tea on you, he murmured. Ethan paused, raising the cup as if to examine its rim, then set it down and smiled. I don't care what the blend is, he said. What matters is that the more bitter the brew, the more pronounced its final flavor. That's where the real taste lies. His calm assurance and thoughtful words carried a depth that belied his years. Ethan had seen more by the age of 16 than most men in their 30s, but even his extraordinary resume couldn't postpone what came next. Without giving Ying or Ethan a moment to second guess, the small launch cast off, cutting through the harbor's glassy surface. Ying had been waiting anxiously for Ethan's arrival, and now that he was finally aboard, there was no time to fret over one wounded sailor. The young man had lost too much blood to continue, swiftly medevaced to the medical frigate, yet replacements were plentiful. Fatigue or injury meant little when there were always others to take one's place. The rocket's freighters pressed on along their secret navigational corridors toward Trial Island, decks stacked with every conceivable kind of cargo, food stores, mining drills, experimental gear. The journey was routine for them, but every mile drawn on the chart carried Ethan closer to the test he'd been dreading and preparing for all his life. Meanwhile, in a luxuriously appointed office high above the central spaceport, a lean, middle-aged man reclined in a high-backed chair. His slender fingers propped up his chin as he watched the grainy feed flicker to life on the video console. The face that appeared was all business, the same squadron captain Ethan had briefly encountered on the freighter, now sounding every bit the eager subordinate. I've traced the boy's path as far as the outer colonies, the captain reported, voice clipped with deference. Every inquiry has come up empty. We even re-examined the wreckage at Sector 9. Spare me your details, the man interrupted with a cold smile, though the twitch at its corner betrayed his irritation. So even you, Squadron Captain Francoeur, couldn't uncover a scrap of useful information about the kid, and for your failures, you've been relieved of your command, reassigned. Captain Francoeur's posture stiffened. He swallowed hard but said nothing, his countenance respectful yet strained. Leaning back, the middle-aged man stared off to one side, his smile widening into something sharper, more predatory. Excellent, he murmured. Keep me apprised of every step Ethan Harada takes. He'll find no mercy, just as I intend. He ended the call, and the image blinked out, leaving only the soft hum of the console. High above, the city lights of the spaceport gleamed like distant stars. Down below, the freighter pressed on toward Trial Island, and with each passing moment, Ethan Harada moved ever closer to a reckoning that would test all he had learned, and cost him everything he had ever known. Captain Lin Hui's forehead beaded with sweat as he replayed the message he'd just received. You're telling me his last mission failed and his powers took a serious hit? Back then, I'd have rated him a solid Tier 3 operator. Now, who knows what he's really capable of? By Tianwang-class standards, Ethan had once outshone that agent, but after such heavy damage, nobody could say how strong he remained. Lin Hui shrugged. Forget it. This isn't interesting anymore. Send for that stink. Why, kid, if he can't deliver what I need in this trial, pull him off the death squad and put him in the league next season. Let him earn his keep. Yes, sir, Lin Hui said, wiping his brow in relief, and cut the video feed. The thin, middle-aged director Shi-Wen remained alone in the dim command center, his brow furrowed. "The Shadow Unit," he muttered. "I thought they were supposed to be better than this." 2 days later, the rocket's freighter smoothly approached Trial Island. Aside from an initial tea break shared by Ethan and Ying, both men had spent the voyage tucked away in their cabins, fine-tuning equipment and strategies for the challenges awaiting them on the island. Ethan stood at the gangplank, staring down at the tumble-down boat that had carried him back to Trial Island. His mind was already weaving its next move, securing the loyalty of every man he had vanquished here. He didn't yet know how many would still be willing to follow him once he left again, nor did he particularly care to count them. From this point on, anyone who pledged themselves to his cause, regardless of their past allegiances or hidden agendas, would owe Ethan their absolute loyalty. That was the rule he had laid down, and that was the rule they'd have to live by. He thought back to the small workroom he'd occupied aboard the ship, where he'd spent hours tinkering with gadgets and going over contingency plans. Everything he'd built in that cramped space tied back to one purpose: ensuring that those who chose to walk with him did so irrevocably. Ethan glanced around, but saw no sign of Ying, his ever-present shadow, for the past 2 days. He had hoped to disembark alongside him, but even now, on solid ground, Ying was nowhere in sight. A part of him wondered if Ying had slipped away the moment the boat docked, or even earlier. After all, with a power level rivaling the Uranus-class elites, needing a mere vessel to travel here seemed almost beneath him. Yet whatever the reason, Ethan decided not to dwell on Ying's disappearance. He'd find him soon enough if he needed to. Pushing aside the doubt, Ethan stepped off the boat and onto the island's soggy shore. A pungent blend of rotten vegetation and fresh earth assaulted his nostrils. Before him lay Trial Island in all its deceptive simplicity, a landmass so small it barely qualified as an island in his view. Even now, Ethan didn't know the full extent of its depths, the hidden tunnels and challenges that lurked beneath its surface. But he knew one thing for certain: every trial he faced here would serve to test not only his strength, but the steadfastness of those who claimed to follow him. And he was ready for whatever lay ahead. Being able to pinpoint an uncharted spot in the middle of the sea spoke volumes about the rocket company's resources. It was clear that this island could only be reached by one of their exclusive vessels. Ethan's cabin had no windows, and once the ship set sail, he was forbidden to leave his room until they were almost in sight of land. He still had no idea exactly where he was or how he might get away, only that the rockets guarded this place with extreme secrecy. The sailors, too busy hauling cargo, barely gave him a glance. When Ethan finally stepped onto the Trial Island, only 1 day remained of his 3-month ordeal. A dark crow settled on his shoulder as he walked the familiar shore toward the abandoned base. Not a soul stirred along the path. Of the original 300 participants, more than 100 were already gone, victims of the island's relentless tests. Ethan had never left this place before, so he'd witnessed its cruelty firsthand. He knew only too well that as the end drew near, the trials grew ever more merciless. Ethan made his way down the familiar ridge-long corridor and stepped back into the base's main square. At its center stood the trial stone, once lustrous and black, now crusted with blood, left unwashed. The makeshift battlefield where he'd fought Guga remained just as he'd left it, its wooden palisades stained with dried gore. If that sight told him anything, it was how merciless Trial Island had become as the contest wore on. He cast a quick glance, dismissing the coppery stench, and headed for the temporary quarters Guga and his men had erected. Pushing open the door, Ethan expected to see at least a handful of survivors, but the room lay empty. Surprised, he paused. Even with heavy casualties, the rocket base couldn't be this deserted, unless everyone had already left. Slowly, it dawned on him. The final trial began tomorrow. No one here intended to stay and fight. They'd all returned to their original forces, each scrambling for one last shot at victory. Those who'd already survived the cut moved on with confidence. Those who hadn't were desperately hunting for powerful allies to pull them through. Ethan took a steadying breath. It was time to head back to Newbie Village. Chapter 287, Betray Ethan crouched in the dim corridor outside the Great Hall. his heightened senses, awakened by his newfound power, capturing every word from within. The hall's torchlight flickered against stone pillars as anxious voices rose in a low chorus. "Boss Sky," one disciple began, voice trembling, "the final trial starts tomorrow. We've had no word of Lord Ethan, no sign that he's alive, let alone on his way back. How can we stand here and wait in uncertainty?" A ripple of agreement spread through the assembled followers. Ethan allowed himself a quiet smile. At last they spoke the doubts he already knew they harbored. Another man stood. "Sky, you've led us for nearly 2 months. Why not take command permanently? Our faith in Ethan is faltering." A heavy silence fell. Then Sky strode forward onto the raised dais, the torchlight tracing the lines of his determined face. "Enough," he boomed. "Idle gossip will not carry us through the trial. Whether Lord Ethan returns or not, we proceed tomorrow. I will not suffer dissent in my ranks." Ethan felt a surge of conflicting pride and regret. Pride that Sky would uphold his name, regret that his own absence had sown these seeds of doubt. He remembered vividly how, on the trial island, he had unleashed a power so fierce it reshaped the battlefield, and how that display had rallied dozens to his banner. Then he had vanished without a trace, leaving his followers in the grip of hope and fear. Nearly 2 months had passed. Many souls had perished in the island's unforgiving tests, and those who remained had grown hardened by ordeal. But none, no matter how much their strength increased, had ever matched his. Watching Sky's unwavering stance, Ethan drew a steadying breath. The hall was emptying now, torches bobbing as the disciples filed out under Sky's watchful eye. Tomorrow marked the final reckoning. Ethan slipped back into the shadows, resolve blazing within him. He would return, stronger than ever, and those who had betrayed his name would soon learn the cost of their doubt. They'd grown less afraid of Ethan, some even began to forget his name. But Sky could never let him slip from his mind. He still saw, every time he closed his eyes, that steady fire in Ethan's gaze when he stood up to Soros's men. And each time Ethan returned from a mission, he came back stronger, more changed than before. If Ethan had fallen in that last trial, fine. But if he'd survived, what kind of power would he have by now? Sky didn't dare think about it. Since the end of that ordeal, Sky had been trapped in his own uncertainty. If Ethan never showed up again, they could swallow their pride and accept Guga's protection. If Ethan returned, undoubtedly mightier than ever, Sky would follow him without question. Either outcome seemed safer than lingering in doubt. A sharp, arrogant voice shattered his reverie. "Well, Sky," the stranger announced, stepping forward, "I didn't come out here to watch you hesitate. Boss Guga sends this message. Bring your people here, and surrender now, or you'll wish you hadn't been born." At the mention of Ethan's name, Sky's face went rigid. "Guga hates him with a passion," the envoy went on. "He wants every trace of Ethan wiped out. If you don't comply, you'll see exactly how merciless he can be." "Boss Sky, what do we?" one of Sky's lieutenants stammered. Before the question could finish, Sky whirled on him. "Don't speak," he snapped. "If you value your lives, you'll do exactly as I say. Now get out of my sight." Chapter 8. Sky's intervention. Gujia had always leaned on his older brother's clout to bully his way through the trainer trials. That arrogance crumbled the moment Ethan's Arbok struck, obliterating one eye of Gujia's prized Vigoroth. One of Gujia's lackeys stumbled forward, panic written all over his face. "Please stop. He's already beaten. If you press on, the Pokémon will die." Sky, patrolling the corridor nearby, stepped in without hesitation. "That's enough," she said, her voice calm but steel-sharp. The man froze, mouth agape. He'd counted on Gujia's reputation and his brother's influence to intimidate rivals, but Sky's mere presence drained his courage away. In the days that followed, Gujia retreated to recover, nursing both his pride and his wounded Vigoroth. Yet Ethan's gym remained unshaken. Under Sky's watchful eye, its defenses held firm. A perennial top 3 finisher in every evaluation, she refused to slip below 5th place, even when Gujia clawed his way back to 1st. There was no denying it now. Sky stood among the elite trainers of their cohort. Word of Gujia's defeat and his Pokemon's lost eye had spread quickly. Ever since that battle, his temper had grown unpredictable. Any slight, real or imagined, invited his savage retribution. Rumor had it that those who crossed him sometimes vanished, only to reappear as the next meal for his one-eyed Arbok. Faced with that grim reputation, the trembling lackey thought better of further protest. He fell silent, shoulders slumped, knowing full well that discretion was the wiser path. Some members of the Zheng Jin faction once saw Gujia at his weakest and plotted to kill him, only to meet their own end. From that day forward, Gujia reached out to his brother. With his brother's backing, he recovered in record time and reclaimed his place at the very top. Ever since, Gujia abandoned any thought of outdoing his elder brother or chasing a rocket's commission. He had only one obsession: killing Ethan. Ethan had become his personal demon, and the thought made Gujia's cold rage prickle his skin. He turned to Sky, voice low and dangerous. "Enjoy your swagger while it lasts. Once you return to the rockets after the trial, you'll be under the protection of Gujia's boss. Don't think you can just pick me off." He straightened the plate at his waist, eyes narrowing. "But here's what you need to remember. Loyalty isn't universal. Not all your subordinates are truly yours." He leaned in, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Whoever holds the power to save you ultimately decides who survives, and whoever backs the winner pockets the biggest share." "Here's your chance," the Serpent Instructor said, voice smooth but insistent. "Pledge your loyalty to our boss, and I'll guarantee you leave Trial Island alive. As I explained a few days ago, only the top 5 finishers in this final trial can escort others off the island. The higher your rank, the more people you can save. Sky, can I count on you to join us?" Ethan's expression hardened, and he fell silent. He knew the instructor hadn't mentioned the full rules. Only the top 5 contestants are allowed to bring those ranked outside the top 50 with them. First place can lead 10 people to safety, second place 7, third place 5, fourth place 3, and fifth place only 2. 20 hopefuls filled the hall. Some might just sneak into the top 50, while others could fall tomorrow's trial. Even if Ethan managed a top 5 finish, he couldn't promise he'd be able to save them all. With his current strength, cracking the top 5 was already a formidable challenge. Breaking into the top 3 would be nearly impossible. After a tense silence, Sky tapped the first person in line on the shoulder, then offered a slow nod to the next candidate. As soon as that individual stepped forward, the others shifted uneasily. Most of them were uncertain they'd make the top 50, but when one man finally moved out of the shadows, Sky's expression darkened. He fixed the newcomer with a hard stare. "Pinewood, you're choosing to betray us? Over the past few months, we've poured almost all our resources into you. Without our backing, you wouldn't even rank in the top 20. Pinewood was the one Sky had believed in most. He'd invested heavily to train him into a true powerhouse. Now, to see him defect to Guga's camp was a bitter shock. At that single act of betrayal, Sky's supporters behind him erupted in uproar, and the fence-sitters scrambled to declare their allegiance. End of Chapter 3. Continue the adventure with a monthly pass. Chapter 288, Betrayal. Sky glanced around the dimly lit War Council chamber, his face pale under the flickering lantern light. He forced a tight smile as he addressed the man standing before him. "Boss Sky, are you certain Lord Ethan will return in time?" the advisor asked, voice low. "Right now, Junji is acting as chief of affairs. With the backing and strength of the Guga faction, anyone serving under them will advance quickly. Even if Ethan reclaims the top post, he has no family name, no connections. How could he stand against Guga's resources?" At the edge of the circle, Ethan listened in silence. He recognized the voice. It was the same officer who had first questioned Guga's authority. Across the table, he counted the men in uniform. 7 of them, fresh recruits sent by Guga, had already sworn their loyalty to the rival faction. 13 others remained under Sky's banner. Some confident enough in their skills to defy Guga on their own, others merely seeking refuge with Ethan after refusing to follow Guga's harsh orders. Yet when Sky had quietly polled them, only 5 or 6 admitted they would follow him without question. The rest, Sky knew, would jump ship the moment they sensed defeat or found a better offer. His grin trembled as he looked back at Ethan. "Even if I could strike down that traitor who dares question us," Sky said through gritted teeth, "it wouldn't stop the others from turning their coats. They're waiting to see which side comes out on top." Ethan's jaw clenched. Around them, the murmurs of doubt swelled into open dissent. In that crowded chamber, loyalty had become a scarce commodity, and the next move might cost them everything. Ethan stood at the threshold, his usual arrogance flaring in the lantern light. "Sky," he said, voice cool and confident, "you've got until midnight to make your decision. Don't keep me waiting." He glanced over his shoulder at the dozen mercenaries arrayed behind him, then turned on his heel. "Move out." Before his command could even echo off the stone walls, a living shadow streaked through the open doorway. A sudden, icy light sliced through the air, and every would-be betrayer collapsed in crumpled heaps, shivering, stunned, but very much alive. Sky and Guga exchanged a quick, bewildered look. Neither had summoned this strange attack. In the aftermath, only Ethan and his lieutenant, Pine, remained standing. The rest of the men, shaken to their cores, had called forth their own familiars for protection. A broad-beaked warbat beating its leathery wings, and a foul-scented blossom that oozed poisonous spores. "Where do we go from here?" one mercenary whimpered, voice trembling. Then, from the shadows beyond the doorway, a calm, measured voice spoke. The smoky shape that had felled Ethan's men drifted forward and settled on the newcomer's shoulder. Every eye in the hall fixed on him, Sky's first registering surprise, then awe, and finally a serene confidence. Those who had never wavered in their loyalty to Sky couldn't hide the excitement shining in their eyes. Even those who'd harbored doubts but stayed true wore expressions of relief or barely concealed satisfaction. In every face, their relief was plain. By contrast, the envoys sent by Guga and Pinewood looked stricken. They stared at the newcomers, sweat beading on their brows, their features frozen in shock. Their companions, standing vulnerably at their sides, were equally pale. Then a clear voice rang out, "Master Ethan!" It was Sky, the first to kneel into a serene cultivation posture, and the first to address him by his proper title. Immediately the others behind her echoed in unison, "Master Ethan!" Within the inner sanctum, Sky might rank alongside Ethan. To the rest of the world, however, he was their elder and superior. The envoy from Guga swallowed hard, forcing down his fear. With a trembling voice he began, "Master, Ethan." He never finished the sentence. In the blink of an eye, the dark crow perched on Ethan's shoulder sprang to life. With a savage screech, it lunged forward, RD, its talons raking across the envoy's throat. He choked once, then slumped to the ground, lifeless. At the same moment, the bat-like creature beside him was caught in the crow's sweeping wingbeat, hurled brutally to the floor, its vitality snuffed out in an instant. It was a level 25, yellow-ranked, big-billed bat, and Ethan barely spared it a glance. Even a clamp-tailed scorpion could have killed that creature before it ever left the ground. He hadn't summoned the bat to slay it. He'd brought it out simply to demonstrate his power to Sky's onlookers, so no one could accuse him of hiding behind elven might. The gambit worked immediately. Those who'd been plotting behind Sky went deathly pale. Only Ethan's true followers blushed with excitement, their voices hushed and eager. "Lord Ethan is stronger than ever." Sky herself showed no outward sign of worry, but inwardly she was anything but calm. The challenger Guga had sent was clearly no match for Ethan, and yet the man had the courage to step into the arena. He'd ranked in the top 20 in every trial and even survived a Dark Crow's assault. That wasn't just a one-hit wonder. It spoke of real, sustained strength. There's a vast difference between landing a single killer blow and collapsing immediately afterward, and striking once while remaining perfectly capable of fighting on. In the back row, a man named Pine went ashen. The moment Ethan had appeared, Pine had summoned his notorious stench blooms, certain he could overpower the elf. Now Pine realized he might have gravely miscalculated, and that his own next move could cost him dearly. Even if Ethan hadn't completely routed United Guga's soldiers, they should at least have been able to retreat. But Dark Crow's shot hit them so decisively they couldn't even summon the Stench Blossom for a counterattack. In that instant, the gulf between Ethan's skill and my own became painfully clear. He strode past me without a glance and climbed the dais to the high-backed chair at the head of the hall. It had gone unused during our deliberations, barely a trace of dust, and not even Sky had sat there. That seat belonged to Ethan. With perfect composure, he settled in. He was now officially the team leader of the Rockets, an empty title without subordinates, but one he had earned. Once the trial concluded, he knew he'd prove himself enough to claim the rank of squadron captain. He wasn't content to remain a commander in name only. The men arrayed before him today would be the first under his command when he advanced. Pinewood's heart pounded. The longer Ethan ignored him, the more his panic rose. He knew Ethan would show no mercy, and he also knew escape was out of the question, given the Guga Force's heavy losses. Thud! Pinewood dropped to his knees, forehead striking the floor in a desperate plea. Pine dropped to his knees, voice breaking. Please, please, Ethan, have mercy. Sky watched impassively from the sidelines, arms folded, a faint smirk curling her lips. She knew Ethan well enough to understand that his reputation for leniency was a lie. Ethan's eyes darkened. He tapped the scanning chip at his temple and called up Pine's profile, along with the data on the dozen stink blooms clustered at the man's feet. Their stats were decent for a green-rank creature, but nothing outstanding. No wonder Sky had chosen Pine as her trainee. He showed raw potential, but his performance in the Grassland Pilgrimage had fallen far short. Had he maintained stronger offensive power then, he might have cracked the top 10. As it stood, his creatures had evolved too early, only to collapse into mediocrity. Now they hovered around 12th place, a disappointing drop. Ethan shook his head. Those flowers were useless. What remained of interest was Pine's lone companion, an elven windling with surprisingly high agility and magic affinity. That might be worth keeping. He opened his mouth to deliver judgment. In that instant, the dark crow materialized behind Pine. Its obsidian eyes were cold, unreadable, no flicker of doubt, no mercy. Before Pine could even register a second plea, the crow's talons flashed out, seizing his head. The motion was so swift, so final, that Pine slumped forward before a single scream escaped his lips. He died still hoping Ethan would relent. He thought that all the hesitation, all the talk, meant there might be a chance to live. Only when Sky glanced down at the motionless body did the truth settle in. Pine was dead. Author's note: 4 more chapters to go. Today's the last day of the monthly pass. Ethan sat in his high-backed chair, his hands brushed with foul-smelling flower petals. Below him knelt a lone attendant, head bowed in deference. Around them, several bodies lay sprawled on the floor of the great hall, blood pooling from their wounds, a sight no one there even bothered to acknowledge. Perched on the backrest of Ethan's chair was a large, glossy black crow. Its feathers were streaked with fresh crimson. With a casual toss of its head, the bird let a severed human scalp, the head of Pinewood, drop to the marble floor. It ruffled its stained feathers, methodically working the blood away. "Sky," Ethan said, his voice calm and controlled. "Give me the current situation on Trial Island." Sky took a breath and began. "There are 98 participants left on Trial Island. Moments ago, one of the adults eliminated 8 more. So, excluding you, our opponent count is down to 91. The survivors remain split into 4 factions. Our faction has only 14 members, which makes us the weakest of the 4. Among us, 1 ranks in the top 10, 2 fall between 11 and 20, 7 between 21 and 50, and 3 sit below 50. Naturally, you're not counted among those adult ranks. The strongest faction belonged to Guga. Originally 28 strong, they'd lost 1 member, killed by the adults, leaving 27. 4 of those survivors ranked in the top 10, 1st place, 7th, 9th, and 10th. The largest contingent was a ragtag coalition of solo competitors, 38 in all, temporarily led by Alec, who'd finished 3rd in the last test. They managed 2 more top 10 finishes, including an 8th place standing. The smallest group was an all-female squad of just 12, yet they boasted 3 top 10 placements: Jasmine in 2nd, another member in 5th, and a 3rd in 6th. After Sky's briefing on Ethan's position in the island trials, it was easy to see why everyone was watching him so closely. What surprised Ethan most was how Sky had shored up their team's weaknesses despite being so underpowered. Catching Ethan's questioning look, Sky offered a wry smile and pressed on. "We only stayed competitive with Guga's crew because we merged with those other 2 factions. Yes, we're in the overall top 10, but they still outnumber us by 2. More to the point, their alliance is just paper thin. They don't really trust one another." Ethan glanced around the makeshift command post, his expression grave. The temporary alliances these lone walkers have formed aren't exactly running smoothly. Even someone as strong as Alec is being kept on a short leash. I've heard the 8th-ranked fighter has a serious score to settle with him. And mark my words, Guga sent more reinforcements today than we did. Those solo agents are almost certainly their true targets. By tomorrow, their numbers could be the largest on the field. He folded his arms and ran through the facts. Back when Gugazabu Snake had ambushed him, Ethan almost didn't survive the onslaught. If it hadn't been for his brother's timely intervention, he wouldn't have recovered so quickly. Ying Ying had made one thing clear. Among the so-called quasi-King Peak captains, only Guga's brother had actually sent reinforcements here. Jasmine and Alec, by contrast, were backed by nothing more than 2 mid-level captains, hardly enough to face Guga's full strength. They're skating on thin ice. Sooner or later, one of them is going to break. Still, Ethan couldn't help but be impressed by Sky's performance. Against all odds, she'd staked out 4th place. Just before the final push, she'd secured the gas bomb that once belonged to Soros, blasting her way into the top 10. Holding that spot now suggests the resources this small coalition brought together were no small factor in her success. Ethan allowed himself a wry smile. In this brutal contest, alliances were fragile and power shifted on a knife's edge. Tomorrow promised to be even more dangerous, but if he played his cards right, he'd come out on top. Ethan didn't press the matter any further. Sky hadn't actually betrayed him, and that was a risk he was willing to accept. Barely, but still acceptance. Satisfied, he turned to the assembled fighters. "Who are the 2 highest-ranked competitors here?" he asked. He knew there should be 3 people from the top 20 present. Pine was one of them, and Ethan had already dealt with him. At Ethan's question, 2 men stood and bowed. "Master Ethan," the first spoke, "this is Fox, currently ranked 14th. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Fox, the timid young man who'd been subdued so easily by Ethan, was in the top 20 now? That was unexpected. "And this," the second man said, stepping forward, "is Tianjin, ranked 16th. Ethan studied Tianjin's face. He had no earlier impression of him, yet he'd noticed something during their last fight. While Ethan cut down their foes, Tianjin's expression had held nothing but keen approval. His broad shoulders, solid build, and rigid posture marked him as the sort of by-the-book loyalist who took brutal efficiency as a point of pride. Ethan nodded once. He now had all the information he needed. Ethan leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "So you've actually begun to cultivate a second elf?" Sky shrugged. He glanced around, noticing how the lower-ranked trainees kept their heads down, too embarrassed or too scared to admit their own progress. What they didn't realize was that Ethan had already instructed his neural chip to log only those students who'd shown both bravery and loyalty. Strength alone meant nothing if your heart wasn't in it. "Yeah," Sky admitted. "After you left, when my first elf was only halfway to adulthood, the Viper instructor said we could each start a second elf. He insists we'll need them for the final trial. As for who qualifies, you've got to catch your own." He tossed an elf ball into the air. It hovered, spinning, before snapping open with a flash of emerald light. A light green bat with a cavernous mouth swooped into the center of the training hall, wings beating a soft rhythm against the vaulted ceiling. Ethan's expression brightened. His chip flared to life and whispered data directly into his mind. Level 28, light green big-mouthed bat, ranked top 10 overall. Exceptional growth rate, solid temperament. "No wonder this one's in the top 10, Ethan murmured under his breath. Spotting his cue, Fox and Tianjin stepped forward. Each released their own elf, brilliant creatures streaking through the air, filling the hall with the electric tension of friendly competition. The final trial was still weeks away, but already the stakes felt as high as ever. Ethan scanned the roster and frowned. The captured elves ranged only from dark yellow to light green in quality, respectable but hardly the finest specimens the island had to offer. It looked like every contestant had handpicked their own squad. Otherwise, the very best elves would never have ended up in these matchups. "So that's everyone?" Ethan asked. "Basically," Sky confirmed. "The top 10 all have about 2 solid elves each. Those ranked 11 through 20 concentrate on intensive training for their beasts. Beyond 20, most participants are barely managing a single elf, usually one that's only been lightly leveled." Ethan nodded, fitting the pieces together. The top 10 fighters probably matched a rocket captain in raw strength, but with only a couple of elves apiece, their versatility was limited. On the island, reaching captain level meant you were a formidable warrior. But to dominate, you needed more trained partners. If Sky could just add 2 more capable elves to his own roster, Ethan knew he'd hit true captain-tier power. But one name still nagged at him: Guga. Ethan's older brother had never skimped on training. There was no way Guga was still running with just 2 elves. Chapter 7. Guga's New Champions. Sky approached Ethan with measured steps, his expression a mix of pride and urgency. "Master Ethan, I have news," he announced. "Guga has enlisted 4 elves, each one as formidable as the Aber Serpent. To make matters even more impressive, that serpent has already evolved into a full Aber monster." Ethan's gaze sharpened. He had anticipated Guga's forces growing stronger over time, but this rapid transformation still took him by surprise. "Excellent," he said at last. "Their combined might will help us settle our debts, and who knows, perhaps even overpay them." Sky nodded, relief washing over his face. Their performance in the border skirmishes was nothing short of spectacular. With these elves, we'll hold any line. Turning his attention toward the city square, Ethan observed the fluttering banners of the Crimson Hibiscus petition. The final day to secure signatures was upon them, and citizens crowded the streets, pens in hand. A lone herald stood on a makeshift platform, calling out, "Today is your last chance. Do not let your brother's sacrifices be in vain. Cast your vote for the Hibiscus banner." Ethan spoke quietly to Sky. "We can't afford to squander our allies' efforts. Rally the townsfolk. Make sure every willing hand adds its signature." Sky saluted crisply and melted into the crowd, weaving between citizens to spread the message. Left alone at the city's edge, Ethan allowed himself a rare, satisfied smile. With Guga's 4 elite elves at his back and the will of the people on their side, victory no longer seemed distant. It felt inevitable. "I'd be happy to help. Could you please paste the text of the next chapter you'd like me to rewrite? Once I have the original machine-translated excerpt, I'll turn it into a polished, idiomatic English version with Ethan as the main character." Chapter 291. The Elves' Handler. Ethan watched as Sky rounded up the elves scattered across the training grounds. Over the past 2 months, in his role as interim director, Sky had studied every elf's abilities and power levels. It was only natural that she'd allocate them with precision. Ethan, for his part, had enforced that distribution without exception. Some trainers grumbled when they received what they deemed inferior elves, sneering that Ethan must be weak or that his own contributions had been negligible. Yet he held his tongue. The assignments were official and incontestable. When Ethan first arrived on Trial Island, there had been about 120 testers. Now, fewer than 100 remained. Rumor whispered that any trainer unlucky enough to draw a lackluster elf had seen it confiscated by the higher-ups, purportedly to keep the competition sharp. Ethan refused to believe that the only path to rapid improvement was by snatching another person's prized familiar. Besides, the island's ranking system was inherently unreliable. During each official test, a trainer presented just 1 elf. Meanwhile, back in the barracks, everyone was nurturing a growing stable of creatures. Who could say that the elf you saw in the arena was really their best? Many undoubtedly hoarded their strongest allies for the right moment, leaving spectators to guess at their true power. Ethan watched as Sky gave the final order. "Everyone, haul these bodies away," she said, voice flat. "Once you're done, head to the Eastern Grove. The elves are expecting you." Most of the others hurried off, leaving only Ethan, Fox, and Tianjen behind. The 3 friends fell into step beside a low campfire, the embers crackling in the gloom. Ethan drew in a steadying breath. "Before you 2 go anywhere, there's something you need to know about this final trial." He knelt, brushing ash from a stone. "It isn't just a test of strength or magic. There are layers to it, hidden agendas and powerful people watching us." Fox frowned. "What kind of people? Our guardians? The council?" "Bigger than that," Ethan said quietly. "I don't have all the details, but I've heard rumors of a secret patron pulling strings from the shadows. And after this trial, others may show up, people far stronger than any of us. If we go in blind, they'll pick us off one by one." Tianjen leaned forward, voice tight. "So what do we do? Charge in and hope for the best?" Ethan shook his head. No. If we want to survive, we need to stick together. Forge alliances, carefully, and don't trust anyone else too quickly. Everyone will be scrambling for advantage. Some will lie, betray, even kill. Fox's grip on his sword's hilt tightened. Sounds like we'll be fighting more than the trial itself. Ethan gave a wry smile. Precisely. And if you ever find yourselves outmatched, say you run into one of those unknown opponents, don't hesitate. Run. Run as fast as you can. These people aren't here to test us. They're here to see who stays standing at the end. Staying alive means knowing when to fight and when to flee. Tianzhen's expression was grim but determined. You don't know exactly how the trial works? I'm not sure, Ethan admitted. All I know is that it takes place on that island across the strait. Beyond that, it could be anything. Trap rooms, magical beasts, rival teams, or worse. But whatever it is, the real enemy might not even be the trial itself, but whoever's orchestrating it behind the scenes. Fox exhaled slowly. All right, we stick together. Watch each other's backs. Trust no one else. Ethan nodded, relief warming him that at least his two closest allies understood the stakes. Good. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow we meet the elves, and then we board the ship for the island. Whatever comes, we face it as one. With the embers dying low, the three friends settled down for the night, minds racing with the dangers to come. In the stillness, Ethan felt the weight of what lay ahead, but also the bond that might just keep them alive. Ethan's situation now was nothing like his last life. Back then, there'd been no final exam. He simply hadn't been powerful enough to be noticed. But this time, the tiniest flutter of his wings had already set everything in motion. His three companions strained to piece together the half-heard rumors, their understanding as hazy as morning mist. Yet Ethan kept reassuring them. He remembered every detail. What remained uncertain was whether they'd even have the chance to face the trial themselves. I've just been appointed captain of the Rockets, Ethan announced, which gives me full authority to recruit anyone I choose. Once we leave Trial Island, you three can join my command directly. Do not refuse when I make the offer, right, Poisonous Serpent? Besides, by the end of all this, I might even be promoted to squadron captain. If you work hard, that rank won't be out of reach. At the prospect of Ethan climbing still higher, the three exchanged astonished looks. They already knew how overpowering a rocket captain could be. A single captain could press them flat. A squadron captain's strength was almost unimaginable. And Ethan wasn't exaggerating. Even the elite elves they'd encountered today would be swarmed and overwhelmed by a dark crow under his command. With only their numbers to lean on, they finally managed to overwhelm the claw-tailed scorpion. Excitement rippled through the group. Now that Ethan had grown this strong, none of them worried about Guga any longer. Besides, anyone capable of ferrying Ethan off Trial Island couldn't be just an average person. Even Ethan himself, despite his mysterious backing, had never managed to leave before. Clearly, powerful forces were at work behind the scenes. If they kept pace with Ethan's growth, they'd all advance far more quickly. Ethan glanced around. Have they announced the rules for the final trial yet? Do we know how it's going to work? His companions shook their heads. Sky rose and said, They haven't released any details. No format, no regulations. But at the end of the last test, the Viper told us that the official guidelines would come out after midnight tonight. And sure enough, the final trial kicks off at 8 tomorrow morning. Ethan frowned. They're only giving us the rules after 12? That leaves almost no time to prepare. He ran a hand through his hair. That Viper, or whoever's really calling the shots, must be feeling the heat. We've spent more time on Trial Island than any of the men, one of the elves observed. Just wait until midnight. You'll have their customs down by then. If there's anything you don't understand, ask me. Ethan leaned back against the tall stool, propping his chin in his hand. Except for the slight awkwardness of the high seat, this outpost was as comfortable as anywhere he'd rested in weeks. Yet despite the calm posture, he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Across the room, the elves set down 2 mounds of reeking mud and a bloom of pungent flower. In an instant, the air turned foul, a mixture of rotten earth and acrid blossoms that would have made any ordinary nose recoil. These elves, however, hardly budged. Either their sense of smell was broken, or they were simply accustomed to tormenting newcomers. If he'd stayed any longer, Ethan would have bolted. He tapped the ring on his finger, summoning a folded piece of treated animal hide. He draped it over the stool's back, then produced a small respirator from his pack and clipped it over his nose. Instantly, the stench receded to a tolerable hum. A shadow shifted above him. Ethan glanced up to see the dark crow perched on the chair's crest, its beady eyes fixed on him. It cocked its head, as if to say, "What about me?" Ethan ignored the silent demand. In this place, even a crow would need to adjust, or be driven away by worse than stench. As he settled back, he wondered what harsher trials tomorrow might bring. By the time Sky and Tianjin arrived, the two stinkmuds were already under Ethan's control. That left them little to do but familiarize themselves with these foul-smelling, elf-like creature, as they'd heard tales of stinkmuds but never actually seen one. Fox, on the other hand, was ecstatic. He had long coveted the stinkflower, a companion-class elf, but as a mere assistant he'd never had the authority to claim it, until now. The moment Ethan transferred ownership, Fox found himself able to draw on every one of the flower's peculiar abilities. Yet grief still weighed heavily on the creature's heart. The stinkflower had witnessed its former master's death and instinctively resisted Fox's orders. To break the stalemate, Ethan sent his dark crow swooping down to reinforce Fox's presence. The moment the crow's onyx feathers rustled ominously, the stinkflower quivered in fear. It had two choices: obey its new master or become prey to the bat-like creature perched beside it. Reluctantly, the flower fell in line. Under Ethan's patient instruction, all three, Sky, Tianjin, and Fox, saw their proficiency with these two unusual elves soar. They couldn't master every technique overnight, but their command over the stinkmud and the stinkflower deepened dramatically. Then, just past midnight, the serpents posted the final trial. A parchment appeared on the cavern wall, etched with the rules and format of the ultimate challenge. New month, new ambience. Hibiscus requests your monthly pass. I'd be happy to help. Please go ahead and paste the original machine-translated chapter text here, and I'll transform it into a polished, coherent English version with Ethan as the male protagonist. Chapter 292, Trial Rules. Ethan sat in the briefing room, eyes fixed on the door. Moments later, a messenger strode in carrying a single sheet of paper stamped with the Viper's seal. Sky rose to take it. The man saluted and left without a word. Sky smoothed the paper out on the table. Here are the final trial rules, he announced. The last stage is a 1-week survival exercise across the entire trial island. Ethan frowned. Survival across the whole island, and for a full week? This was nothing like their previous simulated encounters, and even the initial Viper challenge hadn't been so open-ended. He glanced at Sky. Why the sudden shift? Did someone in command override the original plan? Or did the Venom rewrite the parameters again? Sky shook his head. No clue. Could be political meddling or an order from higher up. All I know is what's on this sheet. He turned the page. They're using a point system for final rankings. Before we depart tomorrow, every team member gets a point device. Your starting points depend on your current rank. Ethan tapped the table. So higher-ranked participants begin with a lead in points, meaning the contest could be decided before it even starts. Sky met his gaze. Exactly. We'll need to plan accordingly. Silence fell as both men absorbed the implications. A week alone on a rugged island, every score tracked. The real trial was about to begin. Ethan sat forward as the instructor laid out the rules of their new scoring game. Here's how it works, the instructor began. Every one of you starts with 0 points. Over the next 7 days, you must steal points from your fellow participants. At the end of the week, whoever has the most points is declared first place, second most is second place, and so on down the line. He clicked a button on the podium, and a holographic chart floated above it. First place equals 10 points. 4th to 10th equals 5 points each. 11th to 20th, 3 points each. 21st to 50th equals 2 points each. 51st and below equals 1 point each. Those are the point thresholds you'll be aiming for, the instructor explained. But here's the catch. You can only gain points by taking them from someone else. The devices you're wearing track your individual point total, not who earned them. So whether you use stealth, deception, bribery, kidnapping, or outright murder, only the final tally matters. He paused, letting the gravity of that sink in. Over the next 7 days, anything goes. Ambush someone in the middle of the night, slip poison into a competitor's meal, hack their device. All that matters is that when time's up, you're at the top of the leaderboard. A murmur ran through the room. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. With 50 participants, half would likely die before sunrise on day 8. Alliances would form, and just as quickly dissolve once they'd served their purpose. The objective, the instructor concluded, is simple. Survive, outwit your rivals, and walk away with the highest score. Good luck. Ethan glanced around at the other trainees, some already plotting with neighbors, others tensing for combat. In this lethal free-for-all, he'd need every ounce of cunning and strength he could muster, and he wouldn't rest until he'd proved himself the clear, undisputed winner. Ethan leaned back, frowning. Compared to sheer strength and resources, most of the testers didn't stand a chance, yet they had one advantage. Their factions were already firmly entrenched, leaving outsiders with no foothold. Still, would anyone at the bottom really band together? Would someone outside the top 50 selflessly bankroll a rival? Don't be naive. This rule exists to make the trials as ruthless and bloody as possible. Sky paused, weighing her words, then continued. But points aren't reserved exclusively for testers. The venomous serpent has hidden scorecards all over the island, and they've buried map fragments marking each cache. If you get your hands on a fragment, you can zero in on several scorecards at once. They even publish the fragment's coordinates, at least hourly, so you can go digging. Of course, nothing's that straightforward. Wherever those fragments lie, you can bet powerful elves are standing guard. Ethan exchanged a glance with Fox and Tianjin. Both of them nodded grimly. If it were really that simple, then none of them would still be here. Ethan leaned forward in the dim briefing room, eyes fixed on the yellowed sheet of paper Sky had just laid before him. Under the single bare bulb overhead, every sentence seemed to spring to life. Sky tapped the first paragraph. Here's how you earn ranking points. You can keep grabbing point devices from other trainees, sure, but you can also hunt down these point cards hidden around the island. They're just as valuable. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Point cards? Exactly. Sky's finger moved down the page to a section underlined in scarlet. And for fairness, Poison Snake has invited the Rocket Superpower Unit to oversee this trial. They've got the authority to teleport any one of us to a random spot on Trial Island at any time. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Teleport us. Where? Sky's voice dropped. Anywhere, and with zero warning. You could land in the middle of the elf's territory. One wrong step and you're done. He flipped the page. Ethan watched the color drain from Sky's face. For the final mission, Sky continued quietly, the Rocket Group isn't just watching from the sidelines. Their mid- and senior-level members will actually join us on Trial Island. Until now, only those of us who started here have ever competed in the finale, and it was straightforward. One-on-one showdowns in the ring, life or death. Sky exhaled, the tension evident in the tightening of his shoulders. This is nothing like that. A heavy silence settled between them as Ethan absorbed the new rules. The game they thought they knew had just changed, and survival had become far more uncertain than ever before. Ethan's voice was low and steady as he looked each of them in the eye. Like I warned you, this trial isn't nearly as simple as you think. The major players in the Rockets treat this like a chess match, and we're nothing but pawns on their board. We don't even make the top 10. At best, we're just fuel for the real pieces. He'd been bracing himself for exactly this moment. Ziying had cautioned him from the start that the trial would be brutal. Now Fox and Tianjin stood beside him with grim expressions. They'd assumed that as long as no top 5 Metamorphosis fighters showed up, they'd be safe. But when the final rules were announced, every ounce of their misplaced confidence evaporated. No one knew precisely how many contestants had signed up. Their earlier bravado was already cracking. They'd been counting on having an adult like Ethan to carry them through, until he added quietly, "Don't get cocky. The ones who entered last are almost certainly top 10 strength fighters. I'd wager the average competitor here ranks in the top 3, maybe even higher, and there are probably around 10 of them." Silence fell over the group. The trial had just become infinitely more dangerous. Ethan paused, choosing his words carefully. There's one more thing you need to know. Tomorrow's security cadres will be stronger than any we've faced so far. A few of them have power levels I honestly can't even estimate. His three teammates exchanged worried glances. If Ethan himself might struggle, where did that leave them? He ran a hand through his hair. If they've only gone through routine training, they could be around our level. But if they're veterans of the advanced boot camps, their abilities could be off the charts. We don't have concrete intel, so we can't risk making assumptions. One of them spoke up in a low voice. So we're walking into a fight blind? Pretty much, Ethan admitted, which means tomorrow isn't the time to chase points. Our first priority has to be survival. With these rules, I can't guarantee any of us will crack the top 10. Stay alive, stay alert. He leaned forward, locking eyes with each of them. And Mike D, stick together. Strength in numbers is our best safeguard. If you see an opportunity to band up, defend as a unit, move as a unit. Tension eased into resolute calm on their faces. Side by side, they prepared themselves for whatever trials the arena would throw at them, together. Translator's note: it's a new month. Thank you all for your continued support. Chapter 293, Final Trial begins. Dawn broke over Trial Island's rocket base, and the main plaza buzzed with activity. Trainers had gathered for the final trial, set to start at 8 o'clock. It was now 7:30, and in 30 minutes, everything would change. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd with Sky and a few others, watching the scene unfold. After today, there would be no more alliances. Each trainer would have to rely on himself alone. Even the most influential leaders here understood that their so-called forces were nothing more than temporary convenience. They'd offered protection and menial support in exchange for service during the 3-month trial. Once the trial ended, loyalty would evaporate, and few would stick around. In the center of the plaza, Ethan spotted Gujia, surrounded by 30 or 40 trainers. Yesterday, Gujia had failed to win over anyone from Ethan's circle. Instead, he'd drawn numerous solo challengers away from Alex's camp. The shifting allegiances were a reminder that, when the trial began, every trainer would stand alone. Ethan took a steadying breath. In just half an hour, the final trial would begin, and his fate would be entirely his own. At Sky's signal, Ethan spotted the man ranked 8th, once a member of the soloist organization, now standing alertly behind Guga. Guga's eyes never left Ethan. The hatred burning in his gaze was impossible to conceal. If Ethan hadn't severely wounded Abai's snake, Guga wouldn't have squandered more than 2 weeks here, whispering strategies with his brother and fretting over the newcomer's strengths. As the only trainer on the trial island with a powerful lineage, Guga had been briefed by his elder brother on the true stakes of this competition. That's why, even at the last minute, he'd worked to amass as many fighters as possible. He understood that his brother's backing might not be enough to defeat Ethan, and certainly wouldn't guarantee victory over the other elite contenders. He needed numbers, cannon fodder, if nothing else. Still, Guga had grown considerably. Though his grudge against Ethan still simmered beneath the surface, he didn't rush to provoke him. Instead, he stood there, remarkably composed, biding his time. Ethan's aberrant companion fixed a feral glare on the lone serpent, while the dark crow perched on Ethan's shoulder bristled with barely contained fury. Though its eyes burned with resentment, the crow reluctantly remained silent, defeated yet unwilling to look away. Nearby, Jasmine and Alex stood unmoving, amusement flickering across their faces as they observed Ethan and Guga's silent standoff. A small cluster of onlookers hovered behind Guga, but their loyalty counted for little against the influence he wielded. They answered only to 2 ambitious captains, far less formidable than Guga's own brother, so they'd never received the same resources. Under Gu's relentless pressure, they'd languished. Even after Gu's authority was suspended for 2 weeks, they still couldn't close the gap. It was clear why none of them dared vie for the trial's ultimate prize, the coveted first pick on the life-saving mission. Just then, Viper and Shadow strode into the courtyard. Behind them, a cadre dressed in black robes fell into formation alongside a towering super-elf. They had to be the Rocket's special ops team that Viper had mentioned, a formidable arrival that only raised the stakes further. Viper paced slowly before the grandstands, his cold gaze sweeping over the remaining 91 trainers. Though fewer in number than before, each one here had already proven remarkably skilled. When his eyes landed on Ethan and the shadowy raven perched on his shoulder, Viper's brow furrowed. Ethan was widely regarded as the strongest contender left, yet his dark raven still fell short of Viper's expectations. Its power level lacked the ruthless precision Viper sought in a cadre-class partner. He recalled the island records. Ethan should have 3 Pokémon with him, not just the raven and that mysterious ghost he'd summoned earlier. Viper turned toward his aide, a hulking serpent coiled at his feet, and offered it a sharp, knowing look before dismissing the matter. The snake's tongue flicked out in confusion. What was he supposed to infer from that glance? Unable to decipher its master's intent, the serpent suppressed a hiss of embarrassment and cleared its throat. "Trainers," it announced in a surprisingly refined voice, "the trial is about to commence. Our teleporter squad is standing by to deposit each of you at a randomized location on the island. You know the rules, so there isn't much more to explain." A hush fell over the arena. Viper raised a gloved hand, and the crowd leaned forward, waiting. With a subtle nod, he gave the signal. Bright energy crackled along the teleportation pads lining the field, ready to whisk the competitors away into the unknown. "Ahem," the serpent called again, and in that single echoing word, every trainer felt the weight of what lay ahead. At the trial's conclusion, assistants guided everyone onto the dais to collect their integration devices. Once each contestant had their slim, palm-sized pad, a device not unlike the honesty scanners from before, they were directed toward a series of glowing teleportation arrays, each assigned to one of the 4 power factions and their elven allies. Just before Ethan stepped forward, Guga caught his eye from the side of the stage. Her lips moved soundlessly, but he understood perfectly. "I'll be waiting for you inside." He gave her a brief nod, and she climbed the steps ahead of him. One by one, trainers filed into their designated arrays until the square stood nearly empty. Only after the last members of the other 3 factions had disappeared did Ethan lead his team up to the stage. The attendant pressed the integration device into his palm. Its display blinked a solitary 1. Ethan allowed himself a quiet smile. Bonus points for turning up on time, perhaps? He slipped the device into his pack, squared his shoulders, and stepped into the shimmering teleportation circle beside Guga. Ethan barely had time to register the strange aura around him before he vanished from the teleportation circle. Among the half-dozen operatives keeping the formation active, their leader, Ying, felt Ethan's intrusion, gave a barely perceptible snap of his fingers, and unleashed a cascade of psychic energy that instantly banished Ethan elsewhere. As the space shivered and the last echo of teleportation faded, Ying murmured under his breath, "Superpowered. Interesting." Standing nearby, Viper's eyes went wide. Ying had insisted he was merely hosting a gathering, but in truth they'd been summoned to keep overzealous trainers, or anyone else, from cheating. Ying himself was no lightweight. He might not rank among the absolute elites, but within the Rocket's ranks his psychic talents were formidable. If he could so casually shrug off Ethan's arrival, then the newcomer must be far stronger than he looked. No wonder Ethan's companions and Ying's own team had reacted with such astonishment. Once the teleportation circle fell silent, Ying inclined his head and motioned for the others to settle in a distant corner of the plaza. He closed his eyes and drifted into a deep psychic focus. Viper, his arms crossed, watched him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Feeling that gaze, Ying allowed a thin smile to touch his lips. "That boy," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, "is something special. Don't underestimate Ethan. Who knows, he just might pull off a miracle." Fresh as the new moon, our story continues. Chapter 3 is now live. Subscribe, recommend, and add it to your favorites. Chapter 294. Tyrannosaurus. Ethan's eyelids fluttered open, and he found himself lying on a bed of soft moss, surrounded by towering pines and unfamiliar underbrush. He'd never set foot in these woods before, and with only 1 week to complete the trial, he couldn't afford to wander too far. If he strayed beyond a certain range, he wouldn't be able to return in time. He sat up and drew an elf ball from his belt. With a gentle click, it expanded into the form of his mute beast, Dummy, the creature's crystalline eyes glowing faintly blue. "Dummy, can you pick up the coordinates I left behind?" Ethan asked. Dummy tilted its head, and arcs of pale electricity danced across its plates. Through their electrocardiogram link, Ethan could feel the creature's focus. It could sense the direction of his original position, but not the exact distance. Ethan's brow furrowed. Trial Island was vast, far larger than he'd anticipated. Back home in the Golden City, Dummy's maximum teleport range barely spanned from one end of town to the other. Here, its abilities had already increased dramatically. Still, would that be enough to cover the island's far side and get them back before the week was up? He glanced into the silent forest, weighing his options. With a practiced nod to Dummy, Ethan braced himself for the jump that might bring them face to face with whatever dangers lurked beyond the trees, perhaps even a Tyrannosaurus. Either way, they had to move quickly. Ethan drew out the tracking device he'd been assigned. The guide had warned that whenever he approached one of the painted map fragments, the device would give off a faint vibration. Tucking it into the inner pocket of his tunic, he stood ready for what came next. All around him, dark crows circled overhead, silent beasts crouched in the underbrush, and ghostly stones gleamed in the shadows. 3 elves, companions from his first trial on the island, had slipped away, only to shadow him again now as he returned. With no clear path marked on the terrain, Ethan didn't hesitate to let the teleporting beasts lead the way. As they bounded off through the wilderness, he dropped small coordinate beacons at each crucial junction. In this untamed expanse, those instant transport creatures were like fish in water, swift, elusive, and indispensable. Thanks to them, Ethan could strike when he wished, then vanish just as quickly if danger closed in. He reached into the ring at his belt, withdrew a small vial, and sprayed the strange liquid over his clothes. The odor was foul, an intentional concoction Ethan had brewed himself to strip away the faint city scent clinging to him. It wouldn't fool a skilled wild elf entirely, but it would buy him precious moments and spare him countless unwanted encounters. Satisfied, he pressed on after the beasts, trusting them to guide him toward the next fragment. "Dark Crow, scout ahead. We'll follow," Ethan ordered. The ebony-feathered bird flapped its wings and vanished into the depths of the forest. With the feral beasts at his side, Ethan pressed on through Trial Island. Meanwhile, at the island's rocket base, Serpent and Shadow sat cross-legged in the center of the plaza, eyes fixed on the path where newcomers would appear. A moment later, a shifting darkness gathered in the sky above them. A gravelly voice echoed down, "Ha, Serpent! Shadow! Long time no see!" Serpent's lips curled into a snarl. He leaned toward Ying and hissed, "I thought it was someone else. Looks like he's come for you." Ying's lips curved into a confident smile, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Let him come," she said. "It's been over a year since he pinned me down. Does he really think a single strike still weakens me?" She swept her gaze over the onlookers. "Everyone's convinced I've lost my edge, or maybe they just underestimate me." Above them, the dark shape solidified and roared. A Tyrannosaurus burst into view on the plaza below, its massive form shaking the ground. At the same moment, a sleek, rocket-propelled aircraft descended beside the prehistoric behemoth, its engines whispering promise or menace into the heavy air. The poisonous serpent glared at the towering Tyrannosaurus Rex, lips curling in a thin, scornful pout. "All you do is flaunt that Rex of yours, and I've lost count of how many times you've stabbed me in the back. Some habits never die, do they?" Ying, lounging against a craggy boulder, flashed a lazy grin. "If I ever laid hands on a quasi-divine beast, you can bet I'd parade it every single day. Jealous?" The snake snorted. "Hardly worth the effort." Ying's eyes gleamed. "Well, you could always buy one yourself if you've got the credits and the courage. Somehow, I doubt you'll stump up the price." Before the serpent could fire back, a lithe figure sprang down from the T-Rex's broad flank. Clad in a sleek black uniform with a bold crimson R on the chest and a military-style cap tilted over his brow, he landed beside Ying without so much as a "by your leave." "Sarkar?" The snake sneered, not bothering to hide his disdain. "What brings the infamous Slackmeister to our little gathering?" Sarkar swept an arm out in exaggerated flourish as if accepting applause. "Heard you two were up to something interesting. Figured I'd take this tedious task off your hands." He yanked a stubby stone chair from a ledge and plopped down next to Ying, stretching his legs casually. Then, tipping his head, Sarkar shot Ying a challenging smirk. So, how about a spar, Ying? Ying sat up and studied him, incredulous. You? Spar with me? You're looking unusually serious, he chuckled. This ought to be fun. Don't worry, I'm not here to pick a fight, Sarkar said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. I've got a mission. He motioned toward the plane, and 20 young recruits stepped onto the tarmac in a mix of uniforms and civilian clothes. Of the group, 4 stood out immediately. Their worn, patched outfits and confident posture drew wary glances from the others. It was clear these 4 were the squad's strongest. Behind them, a handful of trainees wore crisp official rocket suits, less intimidating than the ragged veterans, but still commanding respect. The rest wore standard-issue gear. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable, yet the elven crests on their packs hinted at hidden talents, if not quite on par with the leaders. One of the 4 in tattered gear barked, "Reporting, sirs." The entire group snapped to attention, saluting the 3 senior officers waiting by the hangar doors. Sarkar, unfazed by the shadowy figure's scowl beside him, gave a curt nod. "The recruits have been processed," he announced. "Let's move out." Ethan watched as the final recruit vanished into the swirling blue of the teleportation array. 20 hopefuls in all had been dispatched to Trial Island in rapid succession, each reciting a quick salute to the 3 instructors standing behind him, collectively known as the Shadow Trio, before disappearing in a flash of light. Standing nearby, Sokka let out an exasperated sigh and shot a sideways glance at the Viper instructor. The Viper was easy to pick out, a lean man whose mask was the color of polished cobalt. Rumor had it he was a rockets cadre, though his reputation among the trainees was mixed. Sokka didn't hesitate to voice his skepticism. "He looks the part," he muttered, "but I'm not convinced by his track record." Ethan stepped closer to the edge of the platform, staring up at the floating glyphs and power conduits that held the array aloft. He'd seen superpowered teleportation in action before, but the precision still made his heart race. "It's too smooth," he said. "No room for error. Either the system works perfectly, or you end up somewhere you really don't want to be." Ying leaned on the railing beside him, arms crossed. "Don't jinx it," she warned. Then she turned to Sokka. "So, what do you think? How many of these 20 will actually make the top 10 on Trial Island?" Sokka rubbed his chin. "I'll wager 5. He met Ethan's gaze, a challenge in his grin. "What about you, Ethan?" Ethan folded his arms and surveyed the spot where the last T-flash had died away. The island beyond was out of sight, but the stakes were clear. 3, he said after a moment's thought. "But they'll have to be fast learners, and even faster fighters, to pull it off." Ying raised an eyebrow. 3? You're playing it safe, he shrugged. "I've seen too many promising recruits fold under pressure. If any of them have what it takes, it'll be the ones who can adapt on the fly." He glanced back at the still quiet platform and let out a breath. "Let's just hope Trial Island doesn't chew them up too quickly." Sokka laughed and slapped Ethan on the shoulder. "May the best guess win." And with that, the 3 friends turned to leave the chamber, already speculating about the challenges and surprises that awaited the latest class of competitors. Ethan stood at the edge of the training arena, arms folded, as Sokka sauntered up beside him with a roguish grin. "Or shall we just wager on how many of the novices will actually make it through alive?" Sokka's eyes glinted with amusement. Ethan met his gaze coolly. He knew Sokka's kind, always looking for an angle. "I heard you took a recruit out on a public demonstration not long ago," he said quietly. "Planning another stunt? Remember, the commander demands complete integrity in these trials. As chief judge today, you're expected to stay strictly impartial." Sokka shrugged, still smiling. "Impartial, huh? Coming from you. I won't apologize if the outcome doesn't match your expectations," Ethan cut in, his tone firm. "So save your doubts." They locked eyes for a heartbeat, and then Sokka's grin softened into something like respect. "Maybe I judged you too quickly." At that moment, a booming announcement crackled across the speakers. "Attention all recruits. Trial 4 is now officially underway. Novices, please submit your mission passes and prepare for deployment." A surge of excitement rippled through the gathered newcomers. With that call, the 4th novice mission began, and Ethan, as chief judge, watched them step forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 295, Sudden Enemy. Ethan had led the elves deep into the forest when, out of nowhere, two strangers materialized before him. They stood in silence, their backs turned to the trees, their eyes fixed on him. The taller of the pair wore a sleek black uniform bearing the Rocket Corps insignia. He looked entirely unmarked by battle, no bloodstains, no torn fabric, nothing like the other trainees who'd stepped off the teleport platforms. Ethan's heart sank as he realized this man must be from the late-arriving squad, the only group still unaccounted for. Before Ethan could react, the rocket agent's gaze snapped onto him, recognition flashing in his eyes. With a sudden shout, the man barked a command. "Flare Monkey! Cross Chop!" A fiery simian Pokémon leapt into view, its fur glowing embers of red and gold. It crouched low, muscles coiled, eyes burning with intent. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He'd been lucky. When the teleport spell whisked him away, it had carried the elves with him, forming a protective screen that had likely saved his life. Now, faced with a trained rocket agent and his blazing Pokémon, Ethan steadied his nerves. There was no choice but to stand and fight. The forest fell eerily quiet as challenger faced challenger, the crackle of impending combat hanging thick in the air. Ethan barely had time to react when the rocket agent barked his command. Dropping out of the monkey's direct line of attack, Ethan snatched 2 elven runestones from his belt and gripped them tightly. "Mindfang, focus," he called. Momentarily stunned by the sudden maneuver, the fire monkey leapt into the air, flames coiling around its fists. But Mindfang's eyes flared an intense cerulean, and a wave of psychic energy, mental bind, froze the ape in mid-leap, preventing it from releasing its fiery strike. The hold didn't last long. With a furious roar, the fire monkey shook off the mental shackles and barreled forward, eager to press its advantage. The brief standoff gave both trainers time to scramble to safer ground. Neither Ethan nor the rocket operatives made another move, instead watching each other warily from across the clearing. At last, one of the grunts spoke. "You're a trainer, right?" Ethan let the implication hang in the air. He didn't know whether these agents answered to a low-level commander or the head of their entire squad, but if the fire monkey's display was any indication, this was no rookie challenge. It was clear they'd underestimated him, and he'd take full advantage of that mistake. You know, superpowers fall into 2 specialized combat systems. Purebred fighters can shrug off the manipulations of the mindless beasts, and their strength is undeniable. Ethan no longer ignored the creature. He pulled a data chip from his pocket and scanned it. The readout appeared instantly. Creature, hot monkey, dark green. Gender male level 30, class fighting trait motivation. Held item none. Genetic skills, penetration, undercover attack, siege. Basic skills, anger roar, life-threatening roar, throw, catch, kick, focused gaze, gather, chase, unarmed combat, ground slam, bluff, cross chop, malicious pursuit, punish teachable moves, freeze fist, kick down learner slots, hold, water awakening, shoot down, underkick, shadow clone. At level 30 with a dark green ranking, it wasn't surprising that this hot monkey had broken free from the mindless beast's sway. Ethan frowned. "Which squad are you with?" Instead of replying, the monkey let a small, knowing smile creep across its face, and then it spoke. Ethan stared at the man, brow furrowed. "If you're not a cadre, are you our captain?" The man laughed, but it died on his lips the moment Ethan spoke again. His face soured, confirming Ethan's suspicion. He wasn't a cadre. "So you mean to say you're not afraid of the cadres?" Ethan shook his head slowly, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "I'm not afraid of them, or anyone for that matter." The man froze, then spat out. You're one of those adults who warned us to be careful, aren't you, Ethan? My name's Miyamoto, remember that." Ethan ground his teeth in silence. Miyamoto's features twisted into a cruel smile. "Answer my questions, and I'll let you go." Ethan lifted an eyebrow. "That's exactly what I want. You answer mine, satisfy my curiosity, and then I'll let you leave." Miyamoto's eyes narrowed into slits. His hand curled into a fist. "Do you really think you've got any leverage here?" A tense silence fell between them, the only sound their steady breathing in the dim light. Neither was willing to back down first. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he sized up his opponent. "Let's see what you've got," he called coolly. At the same instant, both trainers drew their Pokeballs and let them fly. On Ethan's side, a round pink cow materialized with a low bellow, his trusty Miltank. Across the field, The other trainer's sphere burst open to reveal a lean emerald-green fighter. Howley. A computerized voice rang out, listing Howley's data. Species, Howley, gender, level 29 type fighting, ability guts perseverance, known moves, flare punch, quick guard, learn moves vacuum kick, leer, bulk up, sand attack, revenge, close combat, endure, wake up slap, TM moves ice punch, helping hand, egg moves payback, focus punch, fire punch, brick break, stomp facing down a bulky Pokémon like Miltank, a full 3 levels lower. Most trainers would hesitate, yet Howley's trainer looked utterly unfazed, a smirk curling his lips. Whether it was supreme confidence or a specialization in fighting types, he clearly believed Howley could outmaneuver the slower cow. "Bulk up, Miltank," Ethan shouted. "Hunker down and boost your attack and defense." Miltank's muscles rippled as it crossed its forelegs, horns lowering in a determined glare. Ethan knew that even at level 26, his cow could withstand a brief onslaught, and with its own strength enhanced, it might just turn the tide of this battle. "Hot Monkey, Howley! Use punishment and frozen fist!" Hot Monkey and Howley shouted in unison. In the untamed wilds, whoever strikes first wins. Hesitate, and you die. The two elven warriors, seasoned partners, lunged forward, closing the gap to the tank girl. To them, the real threat wasn't this bulky, heavily armored fighter, but the pink-clad elf who had already displayed astonishing power. A living superweapon. That was their true concern. Anticipating their assault, the tank girl dropped low and rolled aside just as their blows landed. Boom, boom, Hot Monkey's punishment ability fed on the enemy's strength, growing more devastating against formidable opponents. Her thick armor boosted her defense, but only made punishment's backlash even fiercer. Had Howley's frozen fist not briefly slowed her, the repeated impact might well have shattered her defenses completely. "Foolish creature, try Spirit Shock, finish Howley first." Ethan's cold command cut through the chaos. From behind, his aura flared in blinding waves, the ground trembling under his power. Payback time. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Time to settle the score. This ends now. With that, he launched forward, every sinew burning with righteous fury. The battle's tide was about to turn decisively. "We're almost done paying off our debt. Once that's settled, we'll be able to transform into 4 more beasts." Chapter 296. Repel. Ethan's voice cut through the din of battle. "If you want to win, strike where your opponent is weakest. Howley's out there with 2 other elves. Pick the easier target first." He whirled to his summoned creatures. "Hot Monkeys, circle around and lock them down with a grapple hold. Once you've immobilized them, finish with a low sweep kick." The agile primates answered instantly, launching themselves toward the enemy elves with practiced fluidity. Their synchronicity spoke of countless battles fought together, far beyond the skill of any ordinary mercenary. On Ethan's left flank, the dumb beasts gathered their psychic energy and unleashed a powerful psychic shock. It slammed into the elves' formation, only to be swallowed by an energy shield conjured by Howley. Not a whisker of psionic force got through. Undeterred, the dumb beasts prepared a second psychic wave. But before they could strike again, a hot monkey darted in front of the lumbering big milk tank, drawing the brunt of the blast. "Maintain that psychic assault," Ethan roared. "Dumb beasts, keep hammering their minds. Big milk tank, brace yourself and hold fast. Then activate milk drinker protocol." Though the tank's offensive power was minimal, its restorative systems were unmatched. Ethan knew that if it simply stood its ground under fire, its healing functions would regenerate any damage almost instantly. The enemy froze, astonished. They'd expected Ethan to shield the tank or pull it back, never to keep pressuring it under direct attack. Instead, he let each creature cover the next, turning what looked like vulnerability into unbreakable cohesion. Seeing the chaos unfold, Wei Wei swept forward and erected a rescue shield. Its shimmering barrier wrapped around the dumb beasts, severely limiting the patterns of their psychic onslaught and denying the elves any breathing room. With his beasts' relentless coordination and Wei Wei's timely shield, Ethan had not only repelled the enemy's defense, but was already preparing to seize the initiative, turning their attempted counterattack into their undoing. Ethan barely had time to breathe before the next wave of attacks slammed into their little group. Up ahead, the buxom elf, her long silver hair plastered to her cheeks with sweat, saw the monstrously muscular beast channeling its inner energy. With a whispered incantation, she erected a shimmering green barrier around herself, just in time to block Blazing Monkey's fiery slash. The substitute technique she'd mastered flicked the beast's follow-up energy bolt harmlessly aside, but the force still rattled her balance. She stumbled back, pulled a small milk bottle from her belt, and began guzzling it down as her two elven comrades gaped in surprise. Ethan had insisted she heal properly. She was taking full advantage of the reprieve. Behind her, Blazing Monkey and Hao Li had just emptied their last reserves of ki. Their aura faded, and their next attack hadn't even begun to form. Seizing the moment, the creature unleashed its most formidable mental assault, an invisible wave of telepathic force that struck Hao Li square in the forehead. The dual-element suppression built into the beast's psychic power hit him like a wrecking ball. His knees buckled, and stars danced across his vision. But Blazing Monkey's reflexes were nothing to scoff at. With a guttural roar, he leapt forward and narrowly avoided the beast's follow-up mind blast, which instead blasted into empty air and dissipated in a green hiss. "Move it, you oversized oaf," Ethan barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Get out of her way so we can finish this." Ethan didn't hesitate. The moment he issued his command, the dull beast vanished from sight, and then reappeared directly behind Wally's hot monkey. "Now's our chance! Dull beast, use punishment," he murmured. Drawing on its meditation technique, the beast bolstered the power of its next strike. A well-landed punishment from a dull beast could be devastating. "Hold still," Mind Hammer, a swirl of emerald energy, flared around the dull beast, shielding it just long enough for its weird ivory-pink head, faintly glowing with blue light, to slam into the hot monkey's chest. The impact erupted in a thunderous boom, sending the hot monkey flying across the clearing. Wally staggered back, recovering from the mental shock, his expression darkening with rage. "Big Tank, assist me. Dull Beast, pursue and finish with Mind Shock. Aim for me." Ethan's lips curved into a confident smile. He wouldn't let Wally's hot monkey regroup. Redirecting the dull beast's focus, he set its next psychic assault squarely on Wally, determined to shatter his opponent's resolve before he could retaliate. It wasn't easy to overpower his opponent directly, but Ethan knew one more crushing psychic strike could break his foe's spirit. Miltank gulped down the fresh milk and, reinvigorated, let out a determined moo before using Helping Hand on Slowpoke, raising the power of its next move by 50%. Bolstered by that support, Slowpoke reared back and slammed into Hao Li with a crackling Zen headbutt. The impact sent the challenger sprawling, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, unable to continue the fight. Seeing Hao Li fall, his trainer's face went ashen. He hastily recalled the fallen Pokémon and produced another Pokéball. Ethan watched his every move, ready to counter. The ball soared through the air, but before a new creature could materialize, 3 Diglett erupted from the ground in perfect formation. Ethan's heart leapt. "Dugtrio? An elf?" I murmured in disbelief. Before I could think twice, the man flipped over and landed astride Doodley's massive body. With one swift motion, he drew the elf orb from his belt, clearly intent on reclaiming both the fire monkey and Hao Li. But then, from the tunnel behind him, a streak of black light tore through the air. The man barely registered it, until one of Doodley's 3 heads whipped around and its razor-sharp beak snapped at the intruding beam. To avoid the incoming attack, the black light veered at the last moment and struck the orb in the man's hand. I saw the orb crack and blood spurt across his palm as it was yanked free. Instead of disappearing, the dark beam coalesced into a form I recognized, the black crow that had scouted ahead of us. It hovered now at Ethan's side, the elf orb clutched in its talons. I'd been growing anxious waiting for Ethan's arrival, so I turned back, only to find this chaotic tableau. Never had I imagined it would play out exactly like this. Ethan squeezed DC's right hand, his gaze locked on the Pokeball in Dark Raven's grip. He could afford to let Hey Howley go, but his ace, Hot Monkey, was in that ball. Hot Monkey was the powerhouse of his team. Sure, Doodly might be higher level, but Doodly had never matched Hot Monkey's raw combat ability. Otherwise, Doodly, and not Hot Monkey, would have been his first choice when they entered the forest. Now, though, the Pokeball containing Hot Monkey sat in the hands of his opponent. Ethan ground his teeth and called Doodly back. "Retreat," he ordered. Dark Raven's strength was plainly superior, and even a type advantage wouldn't save them if they pressed on. If they stayed, they'd lose not only their Pokémon, but their lives as well. Duduli's legs pumped, carrying it to safety in an instant. Idiot! Dark Raven spat. Psychic shock! Ethan lunged forward to shield DC, but to avoid the incoming attack, they were forced to leap apart, widening the gap between trainer and opponent. Ethan watched Duduli stride away, the gap between them widening with every step. By the time the beast's spirit shockwave washed over the field, Duduli had already slipped out of its range, unharmed and still gaining ground. Gah! The dark crow perched at Ethan's side let out an eager cry, ready to launch into pursuit. Ethan raised a hand to stop it. No, he said quietly. Don't follow him. Our 2 veteran elves back there are nearly spent, half-used at best. You won't catch Duduli in time, and you'll only be an easy target. The crow's feathers ruffled in frustration, but Ethan's calm resolve held it back. He spared a thought for Kumo, the loyal hunter now forced to carry the chase alone. With each passing moment, its strength would wane, and there was still no sign of the others. Chapter 297, Crowmouth. From the way he fought, Ethan knew the stranger wasn't one of the run-of-the-mill cotters. If he had been, Ethan would never have let him off so easily. In their last encounter, Ethan deliberately held back. He didn't unleash the ghost stone concealed in his shadow reserve. Part of the reason was caution. He couldn't be certain the man was truly alone, and he needed to keep some power in reserve. Part of it was pragmatism. The 2 elves at the man's side, though skilled, hadn't posed a real threat. Had Ethan wished to press his advantage, he could have defeated them without breaking a sweat. He chose not to pursue recklessly, though. In these unfamiliar woods, even a lone-appearing opponent might have hidden allies, or worse, an ambush waiting just out of sight. Ethan knew better than to charge forward on impulse. A true warrior knows when to press the attack and when to hold back. So he bided his time, watching the stranger's every move, waiting for the right moment to strike, or to learn exactly who or what he was really up against. Ethan surveyed the aftermath with a cool detachment. Rook, brute, finish Hao Li. Secure the elven orb he gave you, then bring that hot monkey here alive. At his word, the midnight raven swooped down, talons extended, while the hulking beast, nicknamed Brute, charged in with thunderous steps. Together, they overwhelmed Hao Li in moments. As Rook snatched the faintly glowing orb from the fallen man's grasp, Brute pinned the irritable hot monkey to the ground. Its dark green classification marked it as a rare specimen, already worth nearly 1 million union coins, and its potential only increased with stronger cultivation. While the pair cleared the battlefield, Ethan summoned the Stenchmire, a writhing mass of putrid sludge, and commanded it to dispose of the body. The foul creature absorbed Hao Li's remains, consuming every scrap of wasted potential in a single, bubbling gulp. Though Hao Li had been a formidable opponent in his own right, he'd been driven to submission by Ethan's forces. Unable to bind him to his will, Ethan chose finality over risk. Turning his attention to his own wounded companion, Ethan withdrew a vial of healing spray from his ring. Milky, the great milk beast who'd fought at his side, had already begun to restore her stamina with her own milky reserves, but many of her deeper injuries needed more than natural regeneration. With 2 measured sprays, he sealed wounds and soothed fractured muscle. Milky closed her eyes, lowing a contented "me" as the healing mist worked its magic. Within moments, her breathing steadied and her posture straightened. Ethan allowed himself the slightest nod of satisfaction. They had taken a valuable prize, dealt with threats swiftly, and now, with his allies on the mend, he was ready for whatever came next. Ethan grinned and gave the large milk tank a reassuring pat on the head. "Hang in there, big milk tank," he said quietly. He knew he couldn't reveal the full extent of his power just yet, so he'd sent Big Milk Tank forward to absorb the first blows from Hao Li and that blazing hot monkey. Me. Big Milk Tank shook her head resolutely. She understood perfectly well that, in her current state, she was no match for a straight-up brawl. Once, she'd carried significant combat duties on Ethan's team, but as everyone's strength had grown, she had gradually fallen back into a support role. Yet, she welcomed this chance to fight again. Even with the cuts and bruises she'd already racked up, these wounds felt lighter than those she'd sustained back when she'd been out on her own. Ethan watched her for a moment and sighed inwardly. He'd seen how disappointed she'd been to step away from the front lines, but he was determined to find a way to bring her back up to speed. He'd learned from Xiao Qian's clan that an energy crystal, channeled through a special chip, could boost a unit's qualifications. If he could apply that same technique to Big Milk Tank, he was confident she'd be able to hold her own against simp, lure foes, even if her innate potential wasn't the highest. All she needed was steady use of the crystal, and soon, Ethan promised himself, she'd shine just as brightly as any of them in the thick of battle. Ethan consulted his tracking device one last time, then pressed on through the underbrush, following the silent beast's sure-footed lead. An hour of steady travel brought him to the far side of Trial Island. The tang of salt hung in the air, and bits of shell and driftwood underfoot confirmed that the sea had to be close. With every step deeper into the forest, the opposition grew stronger. These wild elves were no pushover, far tougher than the ones the Rocket Division had swept aside on the western shore. After a fierce skirmish, Dark Crow, Ethan's scarred, coal-black companion, halted and signaled for the others to stop. Everyone knew Dark Crow's name and reputation. If he were caught off guard, enemies would seize the chance to strike. Ethan fell into formation at Dark Crow's side, flanked by two vigilant elves and the mute beasts, all of them scanning the shadows. It reminded him of older, bloodier days, when danger lurked at every turn. He froze when a faint rustle came from a nearby thicket. Through the dappled light, he picked out more elves crouched behind fallen logs and clinging to low branches. They didn't attack, yet, but their eyes were locked on Ethan's party, weighing whether to spring their ambush. Ethan slowed his pace as small purple spheres gathered around him. 5 at first, then 6, and soon dozens more. The dark crows and foolish forest beasts had long since noticed these strange creatures, but paid them no mind, for they never attacked. Yet as their numbers swelled, their confidence grew. They no longer fled at the sight of crows or beasts. Now Ethan heard the soft rustle of tiny feet behind him, and when he peered into the underbrush or up into the low-hanging branches, he caught gleams of red compound eyes watching him. Each creature looked like a living hairball, a tight orb of coarse purple fur hiding lithe limbs, and two enormous multifaceted eyes that glowed softly in the twilight. Normally, hairballs were timid, quick to scatter at the slightest noise. But here, emboldened by their growing ranks, they crept closer without a hint of fear. Even a handful of them could startle a mouse. Dozens made a formidable presence. Ethan muttered under his breath, "I must not wander into their nesting grounds." There was a real risk of being overwhelmed if he strayed off the forest path. Still, compared to other perils of the wildwood, hairballs were fairly manageable, so long as he kept his wits about him. If I can just stay calm and keep moving, I should be all right. Ethan froze and held up a hand. All around him, small, round creatures, furballs known as putiangai, began to gather. He blinked in disbelief. Those weren't ordinary furballs. They were moru moths, the evolved form that only appears when their host reaches level 31. If moru moths were here, their controlling elf had to be above level 30, and where one evolved beast shows itself, more are never far behind. From deep in the forest came a low, eerie chirr. Ethan's stomach clenched. "They're here! Moru moths!" he barked. "Stay vigilant." Instantly, dozens of putiangai stirred and unleashed a cloud of violet powder into the air. Poison dust drifted toward them, thick and lethal. Ethan felt a flash of memory. This was exactly like the poison butterfly territory on the Forbidden Isle, where he'd nearly suffocated under a toxic haze. "Dark Crow, take flight," he commanded. A sleek, shadowy raven materialized at his side. It beat its massive wings and scattered the purple powder, sending it spiraling harmlessly to the ground. Ethan squared his shoulders, eyes blazing with determination. These creatures weren't just pests. They were the vanguard of a far more dangerous opponent hidden in the woods, and Ethan intended to find out exactly who or what had summoned them. Ethan flipped open his data chip and scanned the readings. According to its sensors, these furballs were flirting with level 20, just a hair's breadth away from triggering their evolution phase. If they shifted forms, they'd become infinitely more dangerous. No wonder he'd caught that rustling deep in the forest. It had to be one of the Moru evolution variants stirring to life. He straightened up, voice firm. Team 2, move in. Chapter 298, Malu. The dark raven beat its wings, stirring up little whirlwinds that scattered the flock of furballs around it. But the furballs' assault had only just begun. One by one, their eyes glowed a deep crimson, and soon every single creature was bathed in that eerie red light. Me, they chittered in unison. A surge of cobalt radiance flared across the raven's feathers as it braced against the telepathic onslaught. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. These weren't ordinary vermin. Though small, these furballs belonged to the worm and venom class, and they were born with supernatural gifts. Adult furballs can wield mental powers, even mastering the phantom light technique. The red shimmer pulsing from their eyes was pure psychic energy. Had there been only one or two, the raven could have shrugged them off. But nearly 100 telepathic strikes crashing down at once overwhelmed even its dark resilience. If these furballs were true spirit beasts, Ethan thought grimly, the raven wouldn't stand a chance. Thankfully, as an evil spirit, the dark raven was naturally immune to mind-affecting powers. With a powerful cry, it shook off the attack and prepared to retaliate. Dark Crow, Wings of Shadow, strike them now! At Ethan's command, the dark crow swept its black wings and darted into the fray. Neither telepathic assault nor phantom light could pierce its inky plumage. Every attempt simply dissipated against the creature's living void. In the gloom of the forest, the crow became one with the shadows, its form all but invisible. Its first target was a cluster of furry, ball-like beasts perched on a low branch. With a single powerful beat of its wings, the crow sent one tumbling to the forest floor. The others, caught off guard by the sudden onslaught, faltered in their mental assault. Unable to focus their powers fully, they had no choice but to scramble away on trembling legs. The oppressive wave of psionic pressure that had pinned Ethan and his companion to the spot was instantly lifted. Seizing the opening, Ethan scooped up his friend and slipped quietly into the undergrowth, retracing his steps in the opposite direction. The forest's hush pressed in around them, broken only by the distant rustle of fleeing creatures. Then, through the misted twilight, pale shapes emerged between the trees, a band of gray-white insect elves, their spindly limbs and gleaming exoskeletons moving with uncanny grace. Dark Crow, fall back! At Ethan's command, the Dark Crow, moments ago poised to strike, glanced toward the edge of the forest, where a swarm of Moru moths was gathering. Without hesitation, it folded its wings and melded into Ethan's aura. Even here, on Trial Island, Moru moths never travel alone, and Ethan knew all too well how perilous it would be to get tangled up in their numbers. He didn't wait to find out. Ethan drew an elf-bound orb from his belt and hurled it through the air. In an instant, a brilliant flash heralded the arrival of a powerful creature. The beast landed in a single, graceful step, its hide a deep emerald, wings patterned like stained glass. At the same time, the hulking mind blocker, Ethan's stalwart protector against psychic assault, leapt onto the dragon's broad back. Tropical dragon, let's move! Ethan vaulted up and patted the dragon's neck. The creature flicked its wings once, stirring the humid air, then parked a skeptical gaze on Ethan, as if to say, "You're running from mere bugs?" Ethan sighed and rapped the dragon's horn. "Trust me, look over there." The dragon's keen eyes followed his gesture, and froze. With a powerful beat of its wings, it lifted off, the wind roaring in its wake. Whatever threat lay ahead, Ethan and his companions were ready. Ethan, in his level 40 tropical dragon form, strained to lift off beneath the tangled canopy. Towering trunks and a web of branches blocked his ascent, and no sunlight penetrated the leaves to feed his chlorophyll-infused scales. He knew this slowed him down, but there was no time to linger. A swarm of Moru moths was closing in on the battlefield, and even a few of those creatures radiated a deadly danger. "Dark Crow, Tailwind, now!" Ethan roared. At his command, the black-feathered creature shrieked and summoned a rushing updraft. A surge of wind swept over Ethan's wings, giving him a sudden burst of speed. Still, the dense forest stifled his power. With no sun overhead, he couldn't tap the chlorophyll energy that normally made him swift, and the smaller, more agile moths wove effortlessly through the undergrowth. Despite Dark Crow's boost, Ethan felt the gap narrowing. Especially worrisome were the lead pair of moths. They darted ahead like guided projectiles, closing in faster than he could counter. Determined, he pushed his wings harder against the wind, bracing for the moment of clash. Ethan tapped the edge of his wrist console and activated the neural chip scanner. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the full dossier on the lead Moru moth. Species, Moru moth green. Gender female, level 44. Type insect toxic, characteristic scale powder. Held item none. Genetic skills, harsh, poisonous. Basic moves, gust, butterfly dance, silver whirlwind, struggle bug, stun spore, bug bite, penetrator, supersonic, psychic, poison powder, moonlight, paralysis powder, signal beam, hypnosis, leech life, telekinesis. TMHM moves, bug bite, clear smog, hiccup, unofficial. Move tutor compatibility, none. Ethan's jaw tightened. A level 44 moth was already formidable, but a rare green variant? Its stats outclassed most tropical dragons he'd encountered, and its compact wingspan let it dart through the undergrowth with deadly ease. Alone, a single Moru moth wouldn't trouble him. He'd handled wild bugs far stronger. But dozens of them hovered in a tightening ring, their iridescent wings shimmering in the dappled light. Each fluttered in perfect silence, poised to strike at any moment. Even his prized dark crow, known for its lightning-quick maneuvers, would struggle to break through an ambush like this. Ethan exhaled and reached down to the harness slung over his shoulder. He clipped open the load-bearing adjuster, the small device he'd installed to modulate Dark Crow's armor weight, and dialed it to light. The crow's frame shuddered as the extra pounds vanished, its ebony feathers ruffling with renewed energy. "All right," Ethan murmured, eyes narrowing. "Let's see how you handle a real aerial duel." He launched Dark Crow into the canopy, bracing himself for the swarm's first attack. The forest fell silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into fluttering wings and toxic intent. Ethan's voice rang out through the tangled forest. "Dark Crow, clear the way for the tropical dragon." Instantly, the sleek black crow darted forward. Its smaller frame and lightning-quick reflexes let it carve through the snaring vines and broken branches that had slowed the tropical dragon's flight. Within moments, it left a clean corridor in its wake, and the dragon surged forward, wings beating in smooth, powerful strokes. But Ethan knew raw speed alone wouldn't bring them victory. He pivoted and addressed the rest of his summoned creatures, a band of bulky, fur-covered beasts recovering behind the dragon. "All of you, concentrate. Build a psychic barrier to hold back that poisonous spirit." The beasts bristled, low growls echoing as they tapped into the remnant energy left from their meditative rest. A soft blue glow pulsed between them and the looming leader of the Malu moth. When the poisonous spirit lunged, its venomous aura smashed against the barrier with a sizzling crack, halved, hampered, and momentarily stalled. Though the Malu moth still unleashed its superpowered strikes, each blow met stiff resistance, buying Ethan and his allies the precious seconds they needed to press their attack. Chapter 2. A Brief Respite. The relentless whir of the Moru moth's wings finally slowed to a steady flutter. In that sudden lull, the tropical dragons, their scales slick with sweat and exhaustion, took the opportunity to draw in deep, shuddering breaths. Ethan leaned against a jagged rock at the edge of the clearing, heart pounding as he surveyed the battlefield. Though the moths still hovered impatiently at the perimeter, their furious advance had eased, granting its defenders a momentary reprieve. Ethan wiped the grime from his brow and exchanged relieved glances with the nearest dragon rider. Around him, the once chaotic air stilled, broken only by the rasp of heavy breathing and the distant cry of wounded creatures. It was a small victory, but in this unforgiving land, even a heartbeat's respite could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Stay tuned for Chapter 3. It's going to be even more intense. Thank you all for your support. If you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing, recommending, or leaving a favorite. Your monthly passes, tickets, and feedback keep this tale alive. Feel free to share requests or suggestions. Every word of encouragement means the world to me. Chapter 299. Escape the Birthday. Flying creatures normally have the advantage over insects, yet insects prey on grass, and the Moru moth's toxic barbs specifically neutralize grass powers. That means a tropical dragon, despite its aerial speed, is at a deadly disadvantage against a Moru moth. With that thought hammering in his head, the dragon strained every muscle, wings beating in panicked bursts. Just hold on, Ethan urged, tossing another energy cube into the dragon's gaping maw. As soon as we clear the moth's territory, you'll be safe. His dragon, formerly lord of a tiny island kingdom, had always grumbled about the boredom of an enclosed realm, meager hunting grounds, scarce prey. But now, with danger snapping at its tail, the dragon's only concern was food. It crunched the cube with greedy delight, eyes bright with renewed vigor, then nudged Ethan expectantly, beckoning for more. Ethan complied, handing over cube after cube until the dragon's growls of hunger were nothing but a contented purr. Ahead, pale dawn light filtered through the treetops. As they flew on, that faint glow strengthened, turning the forest canopy into a corridor of gold and green. "All right," Ethan said, voice steeled with determination. "Let's go all out. Full speed, tropical dragon charge." Ethan slipped another glowing energy block between the tropical dragon's jagged teeth. "Once we clear these woods up ahead, the Molu moth won't be able to follow us any longer," he promised. The dragon let out a ragged roar of relief. Between the relentless chase and the gloom under the canopy, his strength had all but ebbed away. Even with the restorative surge from the energy block, he felt as if he'd sprinted 3 miles without pause, on the verge of collapse just 200 meters from the finish line. Every beat of his wings pushed him closer to his limit. But dawn was breaking. Ethan watched the forest's edge brighten ahead, each second stretching like an eternity. Then, as if propelled by some final burst of will, the dragon plunged through the trees and into the open clearing. Birds erupted in startled flutters, insects scattered in all directions. The dragon circled once, scanning the sky behind him. No mottled shadow of the Molu moth appeared. Satisfied that the threat had passed, he banked sharply, folding his great wings, and spiraled down to the dew-soft grass. He landed in a heavy skid, sliding a few feet before coming to rest, chest heaving, every muscle trembling, but free. Ethan glanced back at the dark forest as a flutter of faintly glowing Molu moths swarmed to its edge. For a moment they hovered there, their tiny wings beating in agitation as they stared down at him and the tropical dragon. Then, with a soft but unmistakable buzz of displeasure, they slipped away into the trees. Molu moths were nocturnal elves. They thrived under the cover of night, and this shadowy woodland was their home. Beyond it lay the open grassland, territory claimed by other elven clans. Leaping lightly from the dragon's broad back, Ethan surveyed his 2 companions. The tropical dragon itself seemed unfazed, its emerald scales still bright even after their hurried flight. But the simple beast, whose clumsy raids had drawn the Molu moth's ire, floated down from the dragon's saddle on a thin wisp of energy and collapsed the moment its paws touched the grass. Its last reserves of supernatural power had finally drained away. Nearby, Dark Crow had stretched his obsidian wings to carve them a path through the thick undergrowth. Now he ruffled his feathers listlessly, clearly as exhausted as the beast. Ethan knelt beside the fallen creature and pressed a small, glowing energy cube to its lips. As the cube dissolved on its tongue, the simple beast's breathing steadied and its shoulders relaxed. With its meditation begun, Ethan lifted the elven orb, tarnished and scuffed, from the grass where it had rolled free of its clasp. He tucked it safely into his pack, then turned to check on Dark Crow, offering the stoic raven a reassuring nod. Though wearied, they had caped the Molu moth's forest, and together they pressed onward under the moonlit sky. Ethan knelt beside the tropical dragon and fed it a handful of energy cubes. When it had taken enough, he gently encouraged it to rest its head against him. As it did so, the elven orb it had swallowed slipped free into his palm. Satisfied, Ethan turned to the Dark Crow, offering it the same cubes. But the moment he tried to retrieve the orb, the crow gave a sharp caw and blocked his hand. Clearly, Ethan's protective wards around his other companions had weakened. Even with ghost stones speeding their recovery, the crow refused to budge, insisting instead on perching outside the circle of safety, where its healing would be slower but unobstructed. Reluctantly, Ethan let the crow settle on his shoulder. In barely half a day, all 4 of his allies lay injured and fatigued. The hulking big milk tank, the slow-witted foolish beast, the tropical dragon, and now the Dark Crow. Each needed significant rest before they could fight on. Ethan realized, too, that this final trial was nothing like the earlier island excursions. During that first 3-month respite, explorers could comfortably map out nearby areas, always keeping their path of retreat secure. But now, even a single random teleport could pluck them from safety and dump them into new, lethal environments. With dangers appearing without warning, Ethan knew he'd have to be alert at every moment and make sure his companions were fit to face whatever came next. Day 1 on Trial Island is always the deadliest. New arrivals risk being plucked straight out of safety and dumped into a wild elf nest. If you don't react instantly, you'll become their next meal. Surviving this opening gauntlet is the only way to start thinking about points, gear, or even recruiting elves over the days to come. Establishing a solid foundation, that is, securing supplies, honing basic skills, and learning the lay of the land, is the prerequisite for all of it. Ethan settled against a low, sun-warmed rock and let out a long breath. He opened his storage pouch, counted his freshwater flasks and dry rations, and felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he rested, he plotted his next moves. Trial Island was vast and oddly underpopulated. Only 91 contestants had arrived at the start, and even with latecomers, the total would never exceed 150. Scattered as they were, most of them had yet to cross paths. The true menace here wasn't rival humans. It was the wild elves hiding within the island's dense forests. Ethan reflected on his luck. It had taken barely an hour after his arrival before he stumbled onto another teleported soul, an almost miraculous coincidence akin to winning the lottery. Still, luck alone wouldn't keep him alive. He'd need strategy, stealth, and resolve. With his supplies secured and his purpose clear, he rose, ready to venture deeper into the unknown. Looking back, I realize I shouldn't have let them slip away back then. I'd worried they might, and clearly did, have the freedom to choose where they teleported. Otherwise, how could they have been so cunning? My concerns were entirely justified. If that group really intended to wield their swords against me, they could have sent a decoy to draw me out, then had the rest lie in wait along my escape route. Just thinking about it now fills me with regret. I stood, brushing dust and stray leaves from my clothes. As I'd suspected, the Moromoth elves still lack the innate aptitude and agility required of frontline fighters. But as support units, they're formidable. Their 3 powder-based spells, combined with an array of enhanced abilities, give them impressive crowd control power, and their innate butterfly dance technique further boosts their special attack, special defense, and speed. Ethan leaned forward over the holo display, tapping out a series of diagrams that detailed his ideal battle setup. Here's the core of it, he began. We inherit Baton Pass and Venom Touch through our genetic skill, L-Slot, then learn trait exchange later on. Once you've got that foundation, add tinted lenses as your signature ability. Everything else falls into place. He cycled the display to an animated combat demo. Step 1. Unleash poisonous diamonds to apply a stacking poison effect. Step 2. Follow immediately with Butterfly Waltz, so every buff you've built up transfers to your summoned spirit. Step 3. Activate Baton Pass to share those buffs from your avatar to the sprite, then summon it back in and trigger trait exchange, swapping its enhanced stats with whatever enemy you're facing. Ethan's finger hovered over the final panel, highlighting Tinted Lens's special interaction. This is the game changer. Normally, a fire-type wizard attacking a water-steel opponent only deals half, or worse, a quarter of its power. But with Tinted Lenses, you ignore elemental resistances entirely and restore your moves to full strength. On the flip side, any defensive wizard up against you loses roughly 50% of their mitigation. It makes your offense virtually unstoppable. He paused, then added with a grin, and don't forget, if you can capture a Moromoth as a support spirit, its aura stacks with your setup for even greater synergy. With that, Ethan reached out and tapped the final command on the holo display. 4th order, serve. Instantly, the entire formation snapped into action, each spirit and spell executing his strategy with flawless precision. Chapter 300, The One-Horned Rhino. The domain of the Moromoth was notorious for demanding extraordinary genetic aptitude and rare traits, standards even veteran elven auxiliaries struggled to meet. Ethan knew better than to press forward now. Lingering in that territory any longer risked inviting an ambush. It would be wiser to wait for a safer opportunity. His elven companions were spent from the last skirmish, and Ethan had no desire to rush them into greater danger. Based on what they'd already witnessed inside the Moromoth's borders, any elf they encountered deeper in could be far stronger and far deadlier. Only after everyone had fully recovered could they hope to continue without crippling risk. They settled on a grassy clearing for half an hour. While the elves rested, Ethan whipped up a simple lunch, roasted root tubers and fresh water. When the meal was done, he stowed away the remnants should they need to move at a moment's notice. Rising to his feet, Ethan tightened his pack and scanned the tree line. Beside him stood the massive one-horned rhino that had guided them this far. With a low grunt, it shifted its horned head southward, beckoning Ethan onward. Before setting out on this final trial, Ethan had toyed with the idea of tagging his 3 companions with superpower coordinates, a magical tracking device that would let him pinpoint their exact locations. In the end, though, he discarded the plan. Even if he managed to gather them all again, they would contribute little to his ultimate goal. It simply wasn't worth the complication. Taking a deep breath, Ethan slung his cloak over one shoulder and followed the rhino into the shadowed forest, every sense alert for what lay ahead. Although the final trial brims with danger, it also presents an opportunity. No one has ever set foot in this remote corner of Trial Island, and the elves who roam here are top tier. Conquer even 1 or 2 of them, and your power will skyrocket. Fate and fortune are intertwined, so Ethan lets each adventurer choose his own path. He scans the grasslands and realizes this is a common feeding ground for herbivorous elves. But common doesn't mean safe. Predators lurk everywhere. Darkcrow, the sleek black bird perched on Ethan's shoulder, sweeps its sharp gaze across the plain. Below, clusters of undeveloped worm-like elves, unicorn grubs, emerald caterpillars, ladybugs, graze on the tender greens. These defenseless creatures are irresistible prey for larger hunters, crimson-throated finches, bobos, and the savage BB birds that prowl the skies. In an instant, a BB swoops down at breakneck speed, talons outstretched, its yellow eyes locked on a lone unicorn grub. Ethan tightens his grip on his staff. There's no turning back now. Ethan crouched low at the edge of the tall grass, the herd of silver-horned unicorns grazing peacefully in the clearing before him. Suddenly, a dark shape blotted out the morning sun. The unicorns froze, their flared nostrils trembling as they sensed danger overhead. Before Ethan could react, one of the unicorns, a young stallion already weakened from a wound, stumbled forward, eyes wild with fear. A sleek, dusky bird elf from the BB flock had locked onto its flank, talons extended for the kill. Just as the unicorn braced for the fatal strike, the air exploded with motion. From the opposite fringe of the grass burst a second bird elf, this one smaller, swift as a sparrow, its wings shimmering bronze. It swooped in front of the BB warrior, clashing talons in a shower of sparks. The 2 elves spiraled into the sky, engrossed in their own deadly duel. Seizing the moment, the wounded unicorn dragged itself clear of harm and vanished into the tall stems. But the skirmish in midair was only the beginning. Within seconds, dozens of bird elves from both factions erupted from the undergrowth, their wings beating the air into a thunderous roar. They formed a living storm cloud over the plains, feathers and armor flashing in the sun. Ethan pressed himself against the earth, heart pounding. He'd seen these aerial battles countless times, sparrow kind against BB kind, but never so fierce. The surrounding elves, familiar with the daily contests, merely paused their grazing to watch. No one expected heavy losses. These feuds were tradition, a way to settle grudges without drawing swords on the ground. Among the onlookers was Quintero, captain of the Sparrow Guard, leaning on his spear with an amused tilt to his head. He watched the melee coolly, then returned to tending his horses, as if the clash overhead were little more than a drifting storm. Ethan exhaled and forced his nerves to calm. Here, in the shadow of those wings, life and death danced overhead. Yet down here on the grass, everything moved on as if nothing had changed. It was the rhythm of these plains, danger above, tranquility below, and the ever-watchful eyes of an elf named Ethan. No matter how fierce the bibibirds and warbirds clashed, neither would ever dare challenge the Canteros. With that creature's savage temperament, any intruder's nest would be torn apart in an instant. Although this grassland ripples on toward the horizon, it carries the unmistakable feel of uncharted wilderness. In truth, the wild zone is part of an elven ecological simulation, an enclosed micro-ecosystem that, against all odds, has matured into something resembling a naturally evolved habitat. Don't assume the bibibirds and warbirds prowl here predator-free, hunting only unicorns. In time, unicorns and silkworm spiders gave rise to giant needlebees and eridos, and those new apex predators in turn prey upon the larger birds whenever they can. In this world, the balance of power hinges on whoever proves strongest. Ethan and Dark Crow drew little notice. On the vast scale of the grassland, they were barely a ripple. As long as they didn't make trouble, the other creatures, and whatever hidden watchers remained, let them pass. Ethan picked his way through the waving green, alert but unthreatened, when suddenly he spotted movement ahead. A squad of massive gray-armored beasts stood poised among the taller stalks. One-horned rhinos. Ethan's heart leapt. These were formidable creatures, yet such a prize in this zone could tip the balance of power if he could get close enough to study them. Unicorn rhinos are among the rarest of their kind, and even after evolution, their combat power remains fearsome. Classified as rock-ground-type elves, they make true physical juggernauts. Their attack, defense, and stamina skyrocket at the expense of special attack, special defense, and speed. Their glaring downside, however, lies in their weaknesses. They take quadruple damage from water and grass-type moves, and double damage from fighting, ground, steel, and ice attacks. In battle, those vulnerabilities cover a surprisingly broad range of opponents. Still, few collectors care about weaknesses when it comes to a unicorn rhino. A specimen with strong base stats can fetch a staggering price at the Hunters Guild auction. To the wealthy, owning such a dominant elf is the ultimate status symbol, so much so that many trainers regard the evolved unicorn rhino as the very definition of toughness. Ethan had heard the rumors. The Rhinoceros unicornus might yet undergo a further evolution into a super-armored rhinoceros, a form no one had ever documented. Until now, everyone assumed the one-horned rhino represented the final stage of its lineage. If an even stronger evolution existed, the market value of unicorn rhinos would skyrocket. Intrigued, Ethan moved in with the utmost caution. These one-horned giants aren't like the Kentaro, which only reacts when you're wearing red. Even a slight breeze or the faintest crackle of undergrowth can put a herd of unicorn rhinos instantly on high alert. A group of them, each brawny creature sheathed in thick natural armor, would be more dangerous than any pack of Kentaros, true living tanks. To avoid drawing their attention, Ethan stayed low, letting the waist-high grasses hide him as he inched closer. At the current distance, if the elite rhinos charged, Ethan would not have time to slip away. He forced himself to stay calm. The so-called unicorn rhinos were terrifying when they thundered in a straight line, but any sharp turn robbed them of speed. As long as he baited them into a curve, he stood a chance. I can hardly believe it. This is chapter 300. Thank you all for sticking with me. Your comments, likes, and gifts have brought me this far. This is the final chapter I owed you, and I'm incredibly grateful for every monthly subscription, every vote, and every ticket you've sent my way. Let's keep going. Your support means the world.